Chapter 443. LV Lingyun was berating himself madly in his heart. LV Lingyun. Oh LV Lingyun. Why are you showing off? Only your cultivation base is high. Only you are capable. Only you have the heart to protect Zio? How are your countrymen treating you right now? His entire body was trembling, the thought of fighting Yin Yang with his life on the line. However, he was a man who cherished his life. Otherwise, he would not have said that even an ant could live without purpose, and would not have generously offered the mystical bear core as a bargaining chip to save his life. How could he have known that the bargaining chip that he had expected to save his life had become a hot potato that he could not advance or retreat with? It was wrong whether he gave it or not. Just as LV Lingyun's emotions were in a mess, and he was hesitating, he suddenly heard the sound of water splashing on the opposite side. Something strange had happened again. The group was still in a state of shock, but what they could see now was the surging waves surging from afar once again. The waves in front of them had already piled up to thousands of feet high, and they were growing taller and taller, almost to the point where the top could not be seen. If such a massive wave were to break through the seal, it would be unstoppable. No expert could stop it. I can tell you clearly that there is a limit to one's strength. My control of the lunar river has reached its limit, and I might lose control at any time. Yin Yang said coldly. If I don't get the mystical core before I lose control, I won't be able to control the water even if you give it to me later. When the time comes, this heinous sin. Yin Yang looked at LV Lingyun coldly. Both of us will bear it together. Since we're enemies on both sides, I don't mind having a few more Zio souls under my name. A Zio official's aged facial muscles twitched as he shouted, almost roaring. LV Lingyun, what are you waiting for? LV Lingyun's body trembled again. She clenched her teeth and looked around. Her face was ashen. Suddenly, all her hopes turned to dust. Her whole body relaxed as if she had lost all her strength. He took a slow step forward and raised his hand. In his palm was a mystical core. LV Lingyun seemed to have aged a few decades in an instant. He walked forward step by step. Along the way he did not raise his head at all. Every step he took seemed to be 1,000 caddies heavy. Every step was extremely difficult. The Emperor of Zio sighed in relief silently as he watched him walk out. However, the expression on his face was extremely complicated and humiliated. As the monarch of a country, he was threatened right in front of the country's gates. He could only watch helplessly as his people walked out of the country in extreme humiliation. Yet he could do nothing about it. Furthermore, he was one of the people who pushed for this extreme humiliation. This feeling almost drove him crazy. However, at the bottom of his heart, in a hidden place, there was a kind of joy flowing. Aren't you cowards? Weren't you guys unwilling to do anything? Aren't you all selfish? But, in the face of the threat of a nation's destruction, who could be spared? I hope that from now on, all of you can understand one sentence. When the nest is overturned, how can the eggs remain intact? From now on, they could work together to build Zio's unbreakable shield. Yin Yang watched coldly as LV Lingyun walked over step by step until he was right in front of him. He did not lift his head, only raising his hands to present the mystical core. Yin Yang snorted coldly and extended his hand to retrieve the mystical core. Then, he brushed past LV Lingyun amidst the gushing water, as if he did not even have eyes for LV Lingyun. He walked to the side of the little bear's carcass and wrapped the mystical core in a ball of life force before solemnly placing it back into the little bear's skull. Looking at the huge body in front of him, Yin Yang's heart felt like it was being cut by a knife. Little bear, I will avenge you. I will kill LV Lingyun to avenge you. Once the vow was made, Yin Yang waved his hand, and the little bear's huge body disappeared. Soon after, he slowly stood up, turned around and walked back. He didn't say anything unnecessary. When he had walked 100 feet and returned to the front of the flood, Yin Yang's back was still facing Zio's emperor and officials, as well as LV Lingyun, who was still standing blankly like a statue. He spoke in a low but clear voice. When two countries are at war, they are enemies. On the battlefield and in the imperial court, it is only right that one does not resort to any means. Even kidnapping the family of an important person to threaten is a despicable act. but it is also a means of coping under certain circumstances. This is still a personal choice. However, all of this has nothing to do with me. I believe that no one in this world can forget the legend of the 9 Supremes. We, the 9 Supremes, may not be your opponents when it comes to scheming, but when it comes to kidnapping someone, I think no one is better than us at it. No one should object to this. After today's battle, it has already been proven that the Empire of Zio has no bottom line. Since you, as our enemies, have no bottom line, then we don't have to abide by the so-called bottom line anymore. From now on, we shall rely on our own means and leave our fates to fate. Today's debt, I will settle it with all of you. The reason why Zio has not been flooded today is because I don't care to do things that involve the loss of life. On the battlefield, however, there is no such thing as civilians. As a general or a soldier, there is no thought of returning to the battlefield after dying on the battlefield. LV Lingyun, start planning your escape now. Let's see if I can exterminate your entire family one by one. Supreme Cloud's tone had not been harsh. He had only spoken in an indifferent tone, as if he was talking to himself. However, when these words fell into the ears of the Empire of Zio's emperor and officials, they were like thunderbolts that pierced straight into their hearts, like a nightmare curse that could never be erased. Everyone knew that Yutong's Lord Supreme Cloud was truly enraged this time. The calmer he spoke, the more it showed that he had already made up his mind. There was no turning back. In the next moment, Supreme Cloud's silhouette rose into the air, melding into the water that filled the sky without any hesitation. There was not even the slightest movement. The torrential tide receded abruptly, even faster than the ebbing tide of the ocean. With a splash, the tide had already retreated thousands of feet away. After a few breaths, the boundless flood that could drown half of the Empire of Zio's territory had vanished without a trace. At least, it was no longer within sight. If it were not for the continuous crashing of the waves from afar, everyone would have suspected that it was an illusion. After a while, the torrential tide could no longer be heard, as if it was far away in the horizon. The Emperor of Zio stared into the distance, silent and stunned for a moment. LV Lingyun stood there, exhausted, as if he had lost his soul. Based on his identity, cultivation base, and accomplishment, he should not have felt this way. However, Yun Yang, the Emperor of Zio, and many others on Zio's side, had exerted too much pressure on him. He had truly reached his limit. If he had been a little more forceful, this person would have broken down on the spot. It would not have been a mental breakdown, but he would have exploded to his limit, a frenzied massacre that did not distinguish between friend and foe. The Emperor of Zio's sigh drifted over. Yutong's Supreme Cloud has come thousands of miles for his friends and family. Facing the entire Empire of Zio, he has fought with all his might for his friends and family. Now that he has returned and threatened with the torrential tide, he has done so for his comrades who have fought alongside him. Even when he threatened to annihilate the nation, he didn't do such an extreme thing in the end, causing the people to suffer and suffering. Yutong's Supreme Cloud is a true hero. Even when he is filled with hatred and hatred, he still has the heart of a benevolent man, unwilling to harm the innocent. I believe that even if we didn't give him the mystical core in the end, he wouldn't really flood Zio and harm the people. The Emperor of Zio's voice drifted over desolately. The gap between us and Yutong is too great. If we were to attack Yutong now, the consequences would be unimaginable. If Yutong's people were to be plunged into misery, would we still have the right to accuse Supreme Cloud of destroying Zio with the flood? He paused and continued. Pass on my decree. The army is to retreat and return to Zio to recuperate. We shall fight Yutong again, when our army is strong. Your Majesty, you mustn't. Countless officials came forward to plead and stop him. They did not want the 4 empires to besiege Yutong to be broken just like that. However, the Emperor of Zio had already made up his mind. I've made up my mind. There's no need to say anything more. There was only a cold glint flickering in his eyes now. It was not necessarily a bad thing to not send out the army. How could the Empire of Zio not have internal strife now? Many people in the royal family have conspired and colluded to usurp the throne and overthrow the current dynasty. This has been going on for a long time. but I have never hardened my heart to punish them. I've always thought of resisting the external forces first before pacifying the internal forces, causing the situation to deteriorate day by day. Furthermore, the military power outside has given them a considerable amount of control as well. Gradually, it has evolved into a terrifying balance that keeps each other in check. In spite of this, the empire of Zio is now in a state of devastation, swaying in the wind and rain. Even I, the emperor, can be ousted at any time. How can I talk about uniting the world? I might as well use this excuse to withdraw the army and reclaim all the military power. I can use this opportunity to reorganize the country. Resisting the external forces should wait until after pacifying the internal forces. Supreme Cloud had already retreated, but his arrival and departure had left Zio with an endless amount of authority and a lingering charm. On the way back to the city, everyone had a pensive look on their faces, and their hearts were heavy with worries. Lan Wuxin followed His Majesty back, but he was in a trance along the way. Prime Minister Lan, who had always been meticulous and farsighted, did not know what he was thinking. There was only one feeling that made him feel strange. Prime Minister Lan's hatred towards the culprit who had caused him so much harm did not seem to be as great as he had imagined. For his family, he had traveled tens of thousands of miles to rescue them, disregarding life and death. Fighting Zio alone, he had no regrets. For his comrade in arms, he had drowned Zio. Even if he had to die, he had to make sure his funeral was complete, no matter the cost. Even though he had used and deceived Lan Wuxin throughout the process, it only served to show how brilliant the other party was. Just like what Supreme Cloud had said, if all of you could do something without a bottom line, who would I lie to if not you? Moreover, a person who claimed to be wise had been deceived by another person. He really didn't have any confidence to say anything. Sigh. Lan Wuxin sighed at the sky, unable to help the indescribable loneliness in his heart. All his messy thoughts turned into a sigh. In the dense forest, the moor python's massive body had long been retracted, shrinking into an ordinary python that was only a few dozen feet long. It looked at the thing in front of it with surprise and delight. It was a baby bear. A tiny newborn baby bear. Chapter 444. A little bear cub that looked like it had just been born, probably not even a month old yet. It had a confused look on its face. Its every movement was clumsy, and it didn't know what to do. However, as the moor python watched, tears began to fall from its eyes again. The moor python looked at the little fellow like it had found a treasure. As the cub stumbled back and forth, the moor python was like the most competent babysitter. It watched the cub intently, not even willing to blink. Occasionally, when it saw the cub fall, it would quickly help it up. When it saw the cub run to a dangerous place, it would immediately release the domineering aura of a top-notch mystical beast, ensuring that no mystical beasts would come close and cause harm. This kind of conscientiousness and cautiousness was something that even one's own father and mother would not be able to do. Yun Yang watched from the side, his heart filled with an indescribable sigh. He did not know if it was because the heavens were too kind to Yun Yang, and did not want him to face the regret of losing his family and comrades again, or if it was because of Yun Yang's desire for perfection that he had created a miracle. Although it was not perfect, it was still somewhat comforting. Previously, after Yun Yang had kept the cub's physical body, he had forcefully demanded the mystical core, and returned the mystical core to the Niello bear. All of these were Yun Yang's hopes that the cub could finally rest in peace in a complete state. However, when Yun Yang had returned the mystical core, he had also sent a stream of pure spiritual energy of vitality. The original intention of this spiritual energy was to merge the mystical core and the Niello bear's damaged head into one again, to achieve the greatest level of perfection. However, the original owner of this spiritual energy was not Yun Yang, but Emmy. Emmy, a creature that would pluck its feathers from a swallow, naturally coveted Blackie's mystical core. Although it dared not take it for itself due to Yun Yang, it would still be good to touch it. Therefore, within the spiritual energy of vitality, there was a hint of Emmy's thoughts. Of course, it was only to touch it to satisfy its craving. It would never dare to absorb the Niello bear's last remnant. However, it was this little bit of coincidence that led to a great turning point in the future. The yellow bear was a surpassing mystical beast, and a king among the mystical beasts. Needless to say, its ability was strong, and it had climbed to the peak of its bottleneck for many years. Normally, it would not be able to advance further unless it had gone through many life and death experiences. However, in the mystical beast forest, only the Moar python could arm wrestle with Blackie. Both of these beasts cherished their lives and would never fight to the death. This had caused the two beasts to stagnate for many years. It was also because of this condition that the two beasts submitted to Yun Yang without much trouble. During the battle that day, the yellow bear had been injured many times. Many times he had recovered due to the chi of vitality. Although he was physically and mentally injured, it had also caused the bottleneck of his ability to waver and crack. When he had tossed the Moar python, the yellow bear had disregarded life and death, and the price he had to pay. All he wanted was to protect his comrade and escape from danger. The surge of his ability had exceeded his usual limit. Otherwise, how could he have fought with Emerald Cloud Sword Saint LV Lingyun, whose ability was above Yin Yang's? However, the yellow bear had broken through in the midst of battle after all. The increment of its ability was relatively limited, especially when it had lost the support of Yin Yang's spiritual energy of vitality. In the end, it could not hold on any longer and fell to the ground. It was dismembered, and even its mystical core was dug out. How could there be a turning point in such a manner of death? However, the yellow bear was still in a state of breakthrough then. Most of its soul was concentrated on the mystical core. It could almost be said that the mystical core had gathered most of the yellow bear's soul. Although Emmy had failed to save old Dugu, it had still increased its sense of the soul. Naturally, it had sensed the abnormality of the mystical core at once. Even so, the yellow bear was still helpless. Even if the mystical core was fine, and its soul was still present, its physical body had been dismembered, and its injuries had reached a point where it could not be healed. The best Yun Yang could do was to collect the dissipated soul of the cub into the mystical core, and place this mystical core on the newborn yellow bear cub. However, this was equivalent to possession. Once it was let go, it would completely collapse. Therefore, Yun Yang had used Emmy's unique ability to form a seal. Only when the yellow bear's ability returned to the state of a 7th-level mystical beast could it absorb the mystical core's energy and resume its journey to the pinnacle of the mystical beast king. According to Emmy, although the yellow bear had been reborn, it was not necessarily a blessing in disguise. Its current foundation had far exceeded its original state. As long as its cultivation base grew, and it returned to its original level, it would merge with the mystical core that had broken through its original bottleneck. On the day of awakening, not only would it be able to recall its past, its ability would also break through to a terrifying level. The long process of growing to a 7th-level mystical beast was the process of the physical body and the soul being polished and merged again and again. It was precisely because of this completely unexpected, yet extremely surprising turn of events that the Moar python, such a ferocious beast king, was now guarding the little bear in front of it with infinite gentleness. The only reason was that Lao He was still here, and his heart was clear. This little fellow had the aura of a little bear. The little bear would return one day. I'll wait for you. It looks like you don't want to leave with me? Yun Yang sighed and looked at the Moar python. The Moar python hissed twice, a reluctant look in its eyes. However, when it turned its head and saw the silly little bear, it immediately swung its tail, and its gaze became determined. I want to stay here and watch him. I want to watch him climb to the pinnacle again. I want to wait for the day he awakens and realizes his past. If I leave, the current him will definitely be bullied by other mystical beasts. It's also possible for him to grow again. What if I bring him along with me? All of you stay by my side. Yin Yang asked tentatively. The Moar python shook its head vigorously. For a mystical beast like the yellow bear, it had to be in the dense forest for its initial growth. Only by facing the wind, frost, snow, rain, and all dangers could one become a king. Besides, this was the place where the little bear had started. Only here could the little bear return be more compatible, more natural and stronger. All right, Yin Yang was silent for a moment. Anyway, don't forget about me. If there comes a day, you can come and find me anytime. The moor python crawled over and wrapped itself around Yin Yang's calf gently, rubbing against it affectionately. Then it released its body reluctantly. Its pair of cold and cruel eyes looked at the little bear once again, filled with anticipation and gentleness. Yin Yang sighed and rubbed his hands together. A dozen balls of rich air of vitality floated out one after another and landed in front of the moor python. The moor python took a step back, a sincere desire flashing in its eyes. However, it did not eat them immediately like it usually did. Instead, it cupped the little fellow with its head and let it eat. Before this, as long as a ball of spiritual vitality was taken out, it would be enough for these two kings to fight it out. Now the moor python could actually be so courteous. This courteous gesture made Yin Yang's eyes almost burn with tears. These are yours, Yin Yang said gently. There are more for him. Immediately, a dozen balls of spiritual vitality were thrown onto the little bear. The little bear whimpered happily and gobbled down the spiritual chi. Its furry face was filled with satisfaction. Only then did the moor python feel at ease and began to devour the spiritual chi that was given to it. When it arrived, it still left 2 balls and sent them to the little bear's nose for the little bear to eat. Yin Yang shook his head and smiled bitterly. Before he left, he secretly threw another 2 balls directly into the moor python's mouth. With these spiritual chi, he believed that the moor python and the little bear could break through the shackles of 9th-level mystical beasts, and even break through the 10th level to become surpassing mystical beasts, or even higher existences. He hoped that there would be a chance for them to meet again by then. Yin Yang stood quietly in front of the dense forest. In front of him was a stretch of official road. In the dense forest, there was still a hissing sound that was filled with reluctance to part. However, the hissing sound was getting further and further away, gradually drifting into the depths of the forest. I will definitely come back to see all of you. Definitely. Yin Yang sighed softly. Hopefully by then, you will have gotten to know each other again and be truly intimate. Suddenly, Yin Yang soared into the air, turning into a gust of wind and a white cloud, heading towards the west leisurely. Watching the wind and the clouds in the sky, the hissing sound came from the dense forest again. A huge moor python, its head hidden under the dense leaves, coiled around a towering tree. It raised its head to look at the white cloud in the sky through the shade, unwilling to leave for a long time. This is the best result I can come up with. Don't threaten me in the future. Life and death are always cruel. Everything should have rules. If the protagonist is too successful, all of you will scold him if one of his brothers does not die. Occasionally, one of them dies. Everyone will scold him even more fiercely. Chapter 445. On the other side, Shangguan Lingxiu had already led her men to sail back to the east. She had known that the journey would be fraught with danger, and that life and death would be hanging by a thread. Now that she had managed to retreat unscathed without losing any of her men, she should have been overjoyed. However, there was only a faint trace of melancholy on Shangguan Lingxiu's beautiful and spirited face. Although she had managed to prevent any casualties this time, she had not accomplished anything. It could even be said that she had not done anything at all. This was completely different from their original intentions. They could not even be mentioned in the same breath. After a long and arduous journey to come here, she had only knelt before Ancestor Wudi's memorial tablet and kowtowed a few times. That was all. Although she had helped Supreme Cloud at the crucial moment later, Shangguan Lingxiu knew very well that what she had done was only the icing on the cake. In spite of this, Shangguan Lingxiu knew very well that her intervention would only be the icing on the cake. Even without her controlling the city gate, Supreme Cloud could break it open and escape on his own. He did not even need to pass through the city gate. He could have flown away directly from the sky. If that was the case, they would still be suspected of being Supreme Cloud's burden. Then, what was the point of her coming here? She sat alone at the bow of the 3-story ship, hugging her knees, lost in thought and speechless for a long time. He wondered where Supreme Cloud was right now. Was he out of danger? What would be the outcome of the meeting with the Empire of Zio's higher-ups? Would the empire of Zio's people vent their anger on Ancestor Wudi's ancestral hall because of this loss? Would they destroy the remains like what they had said earlier? Where would the Shangguan family of generals' future be? How far could they go in the future? What would the future hold for her nephews at home? Would their young shoulders be able to carry the Shangguan family of generals' banner? Now that the world was on the brink of chaos, the days of war were upon us. Would the Shangguan family of generals be able to stand tall in this chaotic world? Was she, Shangguan Lingxiu, the only adult of the current generation of the Shangguan family of generals, shouldering the banner of the Shangguan family of generals, yet she had done nothing? If there was no Shangguan family of generals in Yutong's battlefield amidst the chaos, how could the Shangguan family of generals still be called a family of generals? The soul of a soldier? Shangguan Lingxiu could not help but sigh softly after a long while. Unable to contain her thoughts, she could not help but sigh softly. The Shangguan family of generals. Regarding this matter, his subordinates had sent over a few pieces of intelligence, all of which had just been sent over via Messenger Eagle. Shangguan Lingxiu had only opened the first letter when her expression changed. For empires had attacked Yutong. Yutong was surrounded by the flames of war and was in a precarious situation. It was no longer a sign of chaos, but a war was imminent. The content of the second letter was that Supreme Cloud had fought in Zilong City and forced Zio's emperor to submit in front of the city. A torrential flood had suppressed Zilong City and boosted Yutong's morale. The third piece of information: Zio has retreated. The threat of the empire of Yutong's west had been resolved. After reading the first three reports, Shangguan Lingxiu heaved a soft sigh of relief. The situation was not at its worst yet. At least, the war from Zio had stopped. Yutong had Supreme Cloud, so this war was not too pessimistic. However, the fourth piece of news that followed made Shangguan Lingxiu worried again. The empire of Dongxuan's Han Sanha had led a million-strong army to wage a bloody battle against Fu Baogua at the Fortress of Resilience. The eastern border was in a state of emergency. Other than that, Marshal Taizheng had also started a war with the enemy in the northern border. The war was in a stalemate. The southern border was about to engage in battle as well. The war was unavoidable. It was obvious that many of the messages had been sent on the same day. There was even a message sent in the morning that had a new change in the afternoon, prompting another message to be sent out. The situation was changing rapidly as the messages came flying like snowflakes. High up in the sky, there were still a few messenger birds flying around in search of their target's location. The chaos of the world is unavoidable. For the first time, Shangguan Lingxiu's usually spirited face was filled with genuine worry. My country that has been plagued by disasters. When will there be peace and peace in the world? What are you sighing about? A gentle voice came from behind her. Shangguan Lingxiu stood up, as if she had been electrocuted. Why did the voice sound so familiar? Who was it? Turning to look at the source of the voice, she could only see a cloud drifting in the sky. There was a vague silhouette in the cloud. The face seemed to be familiar, but she could not make out the other person's face no matter how hard she tried. The only thing she could feel was that this person was looking at her with a smile. Lord Supreme Wind? No, Lord Supreme Cloud? Shangguan Lingxiu corrected herself quickly. Until now, Shangguan Lingxiu still felt incredulous. Prior to this, Shangguan Lingxiu had always known that the surviving member of Yutong's 9 Supremes was Supreme Wind. Who would have thought that after a trip to the Empire of Zio, Supreme Wind would suddenly turn into Supreme Cloud, the brainchild of the 9 Supremes? And this special change had never been mentioned before in the country. Actually, Supreme Wind and Supreme Cloud are both part of the 9 Supremes. Lord Supreme Cloud said, I heard you sigh about the chaos in the world. What's the specific reason? Shangguan Lingxiu sighed faintly and said, It looks like Lord Supreme Cloud is focused on Zio and knows very little about the current situation. Actually, I've only just received the intelligence as well. These. Just as she was about to hand them over, she suddenly remembered that the 9 Supremes information network was much more timely than hers. There was a 99% chance that Lord Supreme Cloud had already known about what she was seeing, even if he did not know about it before. He would have received the intelligence as soon as the incident in Zio had already happened. At least, he should have known about it earlier than her. Thinking about it, she could not help but say, "I believe Lord Supreme Cloud has long known about this." Yunyang replied, "Lady, you're referring to the invasion of the 4 empires." He sighed faintly and said, "I have indeed known about this a long time ago, but I don't have any better ideas right now. Invading the 4 empires, we, the people of Yutong, can only fight to our deaths. That's all." Shangguan Lingxiu perked up and said, "Yes, only fight to our deaths." Yunyang chuckled and said, "The war is still ongoing. Indeed, we can only do our best and leave the rest to fate. However, I don't think you've achieved your goal in coming to Zio this time. Have you?" Shangguan Lingxiu heaved another deep sigh and said, "Loyalty and filial piety can't be fulfilled at the same time. Everything should be prioritized by the nation. Family matters should naturally give way to this. Shangguan Lingxiu is a woman, but she knows that no egg can remain intact when the nest is overturned." Yunyang smiled and said, "The empire of Zio, in a sense, it has already been destroyed. Therefore, Senior Shangguan Wudi's wish all those years ago can be considered to have been fulfilled." Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes shone brightly. "Therefore, when I left this time, I brought back all of Senior Wudi's remains. How can the remains of Yutong's famed general be left in another country?" Supreme Cloud's voice was filled with reverence. "The remains of a loyal official should be laid to rest. General Wudi's long-cherished wish has been fulfilled as well. I'm sure Senior Shangguan Wudi would be comforted to know this in the afterlife." Looking at the bundle of remains and the memorial tablets in Supreme Cloud's hands, Shangguan Lingxiu felt an inexplicable surge in her heart. She felt a lump in her throat and actually cried tears of joy. 3 skeletons, 3 memorial tablets. The memorial tablets of Ancestor Wudi, his wife and his son, the remains of a family of 3, had finally returned to the hands of the Shangguan family of generals. Holding them in her hands, Shangguan Lingxiu felt as if she was carrying 1,000 caddies of weight. Yunyang watched as the remains and memorial tablets landed in Shangguan Lingxiu's hands. Suddenly, he felt an unusual ripple in his deific consciousness. When he focused his gaze, he was shocked. His spiritual sense could see a small whirlwind slowly appearing in front of the memorial tablet on top of the skeleton bag. It was slowly spinning up with a loud whistling sound. There was a clear sense of joy and relief coming from the small whirlwind, as if a long-cherished wish had suddenly been fulfilled. In a trance, Yunyang seemed to have seen a person clad in steel armor, holding a long spear, riding a black horse that was galloping across the land. Although it was only a man and a horse, Yunyang could clearly feel the domineering aura of invincibility on the battlefield. The domineering aura of being able to enter and exit an army of millions at will. With a spear in hand, "I am invincible on the battlefield." The person galloped among the clouds and came before Yunyang. He held his long spear in a cupped fist salute, his hawk-like eyes looking at Yunyang's face with a sincere smile of gratitude. Yunyang's heart skipped a beat. A sense of loyalty and lofty aspiration to fight on the battlefield for the country and the people suddenly filled his heart. Without any reminder, he already knew who the person in front of him was. His face involuntarily turned solemn, revealing a sense of respect. He raised his hand and returned a proper military salute. The middle-aged man smiled. It was a carefree smile. Somehow, when he saw the smile, Yunyang felt his extremely repressed emotions lighten up. He could not help smiling as well in response. However, what Shangguan Lingxiu saw now was different from what Yunyang had seen. She felt her mind go blank for a moment, as if 3 people had suddenly appeared before her eyes. A middle-aged man with a tall and muscular build, his face square and stern, his eyes as sharp and spirited as a hawk's. Beside him was a petite girl with a gentle face. Both of them stood in front of her as if they were real, looking at her with smiles on their faces that were filled with intimacy. In front of them was a little boy who seemed to be only 3 or 4 years old, yet he seemed to be only 2 or 3 years old at the same time. His face was filled with innocence. Such a harmonious family of 3 had appeared in front of her, smiling at her. The comfort, the praise, and the feeling that blood was thicker than water allowed Shangguan Lingxiu to immediately know who the three people before her were. Ancestor peerless? Shangguan Lingxiu blurted out. Chapter 446. In front of Shangguan Lingxiu, the middle-aged man smiled. It was a smile of relief that came from letting go of everything and finally having no more worries. As for the gentle lady beside him, she pointed at Shangguan Lingxiu, and then at Lord Supreme Cloud, who was standing beside her. Then, she held her husband's hand tightly in hers. Looking at Shangguan Lingxiu's smile, there was a strange meaning to it. It seemed to be a blessing, a reminder, and also. However, the middle-aged man shook his head and held his wife's hand tightly, as if his wife wanted to say something but was stopped by her husband. A helpless smile hung on the gentle lady's face. She glanced at Shangguan Lingxiu again, the corners of her lips curling into a smile. Then, the man and the lady turned at the same time, and bowed solemnly in the direction of Tiantang in the east. Then, they straightened up and turned back to look at Shangguan Lingxiu once more. The middle-aged man waved his hand. Then, he took the hand of the lady beside him and carried the child. A horse suddenly appeared in the air, and the three of them landed on its back at the same time. The horse carried the three of them, and galloped through the clouds and fog. As it galloped, both the man and the horse suddenly turned into a gust of wind and disappeared. Although the memorial tablets in front of Yun Yang and Shangguan Lingxiu did not budge, the three parcels that contained the bones suddenly deflated at the same time. The difference in the weight in her hands was obvious. Shangguan Lingxiu felt like she had just woken up from a dream, and quickly opened the parcels to look at the contents. As expected, there was nothing left in the three skeletal bundles, only a pile of white ashes remained. That was Ancestor Wudi. Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes were misty with tears, but she was smiling. The old man's wish has finally been fulfilled. He left in peace, bringing his beloved wife and son to the netherworld to accompany them. Yun Yang heaved a long sigh of relief and said, "Today has been an eye-opener for me as well. It's true that the heroic spirit lives on forever." Shangguan Lingxiu smiled through her tears and said, "This is also my first time seeing Ancestor Wudi. He is indeed a senior of the Shangguan family of generals. Such grace and bearing have never been seen by any other general today." Yun Yang said in a low voice, "Invincible is invincible." He had to admit that it was no wonder the Empire of Ziyou had resorted to despicable means to destroy General Shangguan Wudi back then. His invincible aura was truly admirable. It was as if, even in the midst of a million-strong army, as long as this person rode out, he would be an invincible existence. He was an invincible hero. This feeling had long been deeply engraved in the hearts of everyone on both sides. No one believed that they could defeat such an expert on the battlefield. Unparalleled divine general. Yun Yang gave his own comment. "It's a pity." He stopped halfway through his sentence. No matter what, Shangguan Wudi's wish was finally achieved. It was better not to say anything else, lest it desecrate this invincible heroic spirit. I hope that this invincible general, together with his beloved wife and son, will have a good journey and not be lonely in the afterlife. Handing the remains of Shangguan Wudi's family of three to Shangguan Lingxiu was the end of this trip to Ziyou. Yun Yang truly wanted to rest for a while now. During this period of time, especially the last few days, he had been utterly exhausted. First, he had plotted and sneaked into Zilong City. He had been constantly on tenterhooks, contending with Ziyou's higher-ups. When he had finally met old Dugu, it had been a series of battles. When he had charged out of Zilong City, he had only managed to divert the Lunar River's water to the border of Zilong City, in a state of near exhaustion. Although the diversion of the Lunar River's water seemed massive, Yin Yang knew himself well. He could only divert a very small portion of the river's water. He would not be able to divert the entire Lunar River's water, over even if he was beaten to death. The billowing white waves that everyone saw were real, but other than the monstrous waves at the front, there were only a few scattered streams of water at the back. It was not as massive as what Ziyou's people and officials had seen. The terrifying, boundless water was actually a bluff that Yun Yang had created with his holy water charm. Life was like a show. It all depended on one's acting skills. If Yin Yang's holy water charm cultivation base could really divert the entire lunar river here, he would not have said that he would arrive in an hour. But in reality, it would not have taken him 4 hours to arrive. He was late. That was the real reason. Yin Yang had exhausted all of his spiritual energy then, but he still could not successfully divert the lunar river's water to the border of Zilong City. In the end, it was Emmy's great effort that had allowed him to divert a portion of the lunar river's water over. In order to divert the lunar river's water to this point, Yin Yang had expended most of his spiritual energy. It could be said that Yin Yang's condescending attitude towards Zio's people and officials was all a bluff. A bluff. In spite of this, the incident with the little bear had once again drained a large portion of Yin Yang's energy. When he left in the form of a stream, and appeared to be relaxed to others, he was actually at the end of his tether. Yin Yang had almost fainted in the stream. It was only with his willpower that he managed to hold on until he was far away from Zio's people's field of vision. Only then did he have the time to recover. It was also then that Emmy had told him about the little bear's death. That was how the trip to the dense forest had been made, bringing the little bear back to life and restarting his cultivation journey. Of course, the act of saving the little bear had drained the mystical qi that Yin Yang had just recovered. When Yin Yang landed on Shangguan Lingxiu's boat, it was the weakest and most helpless moment of his life. The only thing he felt was that he was extremely exhausted, his vision was darkening, and he could fall asleep at any time. If an enemy had coincidentally come at this time, Yin Yang could only resign himself to his fate and allow himself to be trampled upon. The spiritual energy of vitality was not a universal remedy. At least, it was helpless against Yin Yang's current state of exhaustion. Now that Shangguan Wudi's matter had come to an end, Yin Yang felt that he could not hold on any longer. Without another word he asked, "Lady Shangguan, can you prepare a quiet room for me? Don't let anyone disturb me. I need to rest." Upon hearing Lord Supreme Cloud's unexpected words, Shangguan Lingxiu understood immediately. Lord Supreme Cloud seemed to be exhausted these few days. What he had done was not something a normal human could do. No matter which one it was a miracle beyond imagination. How could there not be exhaustion after doing something like this? Even if one had an unparalleled cultivation base, one would have been completely drained after coming to this stage. Moreover, Supreme Cloud had never been known for his physical strength. "I have indeed neglected this," Shangguan Lingxiu said apologetically, and immediately ordered that no one was allowed to go up to the 3rd level of the ship. After that, he directly vacated the largest bedroom on the 3rd floor, tidied up a little, and then quietly left. With a wave of Yin Yang's hand, a cloud of fog materialized and settled at the door. This was the last safety measure that his mind, which was close to being muddled from exhaustion, could come up with. Once someone tried to force their way into the room and triggered the cloud, Yin Yang would be alerted at once and react in time. Then he lay down on the bed, and before his head even touched the pillow, he had already fallen asleep. In his sleep, Yin Yang felt like he was in a trance, like he was in a dream, like he was in a trance. In a trance, he felt like he was reunited with his brothers again, the 9 of them going out on a mission together. A gentle and blissful smile hung on the corners of his lips. Eldest brother, 2nd brother, 3rd sister, 4th brother, 5th brother, 6th brother, 7th brother, 8th brother. What are we going to do today? The ambush fortress? All right, I happen to have the information there. Wait for me, I'll come up with a plan. Something else today? All right, I'll come up with the plan. OL 9th, don't tire yourself out. A balance between work and rest is the way to go in the long run. There's no need to rush. I'm not tired. How can I be tired? As long as everyone is together, I won't be tired no matter how much I do. I miss you all so much. In his sleep, Yin Yang vaguely felt that something was amiss. He was with his brothers now, why was he missing them? Her brothers were all looking at her and smiling. Were they laughing at her foolishness? Right, 5th brother, have you found Sister Yu? You picked her up, didn't you? Young brother. Yin Zuyu's silhouette appeared, the same smile on her face. Sister Yu, you've done me and then, you've killed me. You've scared me to death. Yin Yang bawled in his sleep. I thought I was the one who dragged you into this, and caused your death. I. He cried as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. All the accumulated stress, grievances, and longing that had been buried in his heart poured out like a broken dam. Yin Yang, who was sleeping quietly on the bed, wore a smile that came from the bottom of his heart, but the corners of his eyes were filled with tears. The laughter in his dream continued. The 9 Supremes were still carrying out their missions endlessly. Yin Yang only hoped that the missions would never be completed. It would be best if there was always something to do. Because of this, everyone can always be together forever. It was a pity that no matter how many or how complicated the mission was, there would come a time when it came to an end. All the missions were completed, the speed of completion far exceeding Yin Yang's expectations. The missions had been completed successfully. Why would I still feel indignant? What was there to be indignant about? Looks like I've really tired myself out. Let's go and eat Chinese cabbage and tofu later. This was his eldest brother's suggestion. The brothers responded in unison. In the next moment, all 9 brothers had arrived at the small rundown tavern. Old Duga's back was still hunched as he sat in front of the door, watching his brothers enter with a warm and comforting smile on his old face. It was like he was watching his long-lost sons return one after another. There was still a table for each of them, a plate of Chinese cabbage and tofu for each of them, a pot of wine for each of them. The refreshing aroma filled the entire narrow room. Yin Yang ate greedily, feeling the warmth in his heart overflowing as he ate. It was too delicious. It was too delicious. He could not get enough of it no matter how much he ate. Yin Yang realized that his dishes were all gone while his brothers still had a full plate in front of them. They were moving their chopsticks swiftly, eating contentedly, like a child who had finished his candy first, or like Zhu Beiji who had eaten the ginseng fruit first. Yin Yang, who was salivating, did not care about his image at all. He stood up and picked up his chopsticks, wanting to take another bite with a drooling face, but was stopped by the crowd outside. You're not letting me eat. Yin Yang was stunned. The eldest Supreme Earth raised his head. It was the eldest prince's face as he looked at Yin Yang warmly. Oh, ninth, you can't eat what we're eating. What do you mean I can't eat? It's the same thing. I've just finished a plate. Yin Yang was stubborn. I'll only take one bite. Just one bite. Brothers, can't you give this young brother a bite? Facing Yin Yang, who had gone from being stubborn to acting coquettishly and shamelessly, the brothers were all smiling warmly. They looked at him, but shook their heads resolutely, rejecting him. Old Dugu, with his hunched back, smiled kindly as he stood aside and said, Why are you so hung up on this? Isn't it easy if you want to eat? Didn't I teach you how to do it? If you want to eat, can't you cook it yourself? No. Yin Yang was stubborn. I want to eat theirs. I want a bite from each of them. What's so special about cooking it myself? Before Yin Yang's words echoed in his ears and heart, the small tavern suddenly disappeared. The big brothers were no longer in their original positions. They all stood up and walked away. 8 or 9 of them chatted and laughed as old Dugu followed behind them. They chatted and laughed as they walked into the distance. Surprisingly, no one paid any attention to him. Yin Yang looked around, not knowing what to do. As far as his eyes could see, the sky was tens of thousands of miles high, and the ground was covered in yellow sand. Looking into the distance, there was not a single cloud of smoke, not even a tree or a blade of grass. There were no living creatures in this land at all. In fact, he was the only living creature left in this entire world. Naturally, no one would care about him. Yin Yang asked in a daze, Where are all of you going? Why didn't you bring me along? The dozen silhouettes further away were still conversing intimately with each other, their silhouettes moving further and further away. Still, no one responded to his question. Yin Yang's anxiety grew as he dashed out. Wait for me. Wait for me. Let's go together. However, the group in front of him moved faster and faster, the distance between them growing further. The silhouettes on the other side gradually turned into a cluster of black dots, before disappearing completely. Then, Yin Yang felt as if his brothers had turned into the stars in the sky. They were still blinking at him. Then the wind came, the rain came, and the snow came, torrential rains, floods, fires, lightning, tribulations, and countless catastrophes. Blood and fire intersected. In this devastated world, he was the only one left to struggle, to fight, and to roar. He needed help. He needed someone to accompany him on this journey. However, no one came. He was the only one holding on, holding on, holding on. While he was still in a trance, a figure swayed in front of him. Old Dugu appeared again with his hunched back. He still had that warm smile on his face as he looked at him with pity. "Child, go back. This is not a place for you." "I'm not going back." Yin Yang roared, tears in his eyes as he said stubbornly, "I'm not going back." Old Dugu looked at him sympathetically and said softly, "Child, remember to take care of yourself in the future." As he spoke, he stretched out a hand and seemed to hesitate for a moment before slapping Yin Yang's shoulder. Yin Yang cried out, feeling his body retreating uncontrollably. Old Dugu, who was in front of him, was getting further and further away from him. Gradually, he could not see him anymore, just like everyone else. Yet, he was still flying back involuntarily. Yin Yang struggled as he flew and roared, "I'm not going back. I don't want to go back. Don't even think of leaving me behind. You say we're brothers of one heart. You say we'll go through thick and thin together. Now you want to leave me behind? It won't be so easy." Yin Yang roared, "There's no such thing in this world. I'll find all of you no matter where I go. Don't leave me alone. I'm the only one left in this world. What's the point if I'm alone? I'm the only one left. Can't you see? How much have I suffered? I can't take it anymore. I really can't take it anymore. Take me away. Take me with you. Take me with you. Wait for me. Big brothers, wait for me. Wait for me." Outside, Shangguan Lingxiu's face was wet with tears, her expression forlorn. She had been sitting here since yesterday while Supreme Cloud had slept for a day and a night. Later on, for some reason, as if he had encountered a nightmare, he cried and screamed uncontrollably. His hoarse growls were heart-wrenching. She could hear Supreme Cloud's murmurs clearly. Although she could not understand most of it, she could still understand some of it. These were things that Supreme Cloud would never have said, even if he was beaten to death when he was awake. He was a god in the empire of Yutong. A living god. How could he show such fragile emotions? Perhaps only when he was so tired that he couldn't support himself, so tired that he couldn't control his subconscious mind, coupled with the huge blow to his body and mind. When he really couldn't bear it, would he vent a little in the dream? Especially when he heard, "I'm not going back. I don't want to go back. Don't even think of leaving me behind. Don't leave me alone. I'm the only one left in this world. Can't you all see how much I'm suffering? I can't take it anymore. Take me away. I miss you all. I miss you all so much." Shangguan Lingxiu was sobbing her eyes out. If she were in his shoes, if she were Supreme Cloud and her brothers, who had always been like brothers, had all died in battle in a day, what would happen to her if she was left alone in this world? What was more, she would have to shoulder so many responsibilities when she was the only one left. Almost the entire empire's mental support was on her shoulders. She still had to take revenge. She still had to do things. She still had to shoulder responsibilities. She had to fight and kill. She had to face endless traps. She had to face all the despicable, filthy, noble, everything in this world. The spies in the imperial court, the forces of the martial world, the hostile countries, the 4 battlefields. All of these were originally the shared responsibilities of 9 people, each with their own division of labor and effort. Now that there was only one person left, the workload had multiplied. The loneliness, the desolation, the helplessness of being alone. Yet he still had to press forward, to persevere with unwavering determination. Even a man of steel would not have been able to hold on for so long. It was said that the assassin from the Empire of Zio, this time, was a relative of one of the 9 Supremes. Supreme Cloud's arrival this time was to witness the passing of a relative with his own eyes. Even if he had slain countless enemies in this battle and won, what was the use? His kin could not be brought back to life. He was even more lonely in this world. His heart was broken, his soul was broken as well. How had Lord Supreme Cloud been able to hold on? Even if it was just a dream, he had to send everyone away. so that he could cry and curse in his sleep in a private space that belonged to him. Shangguan Lingxiu could empathize with the loneliness that bordered on despair. She felt like her heart was being torn apart. Shangguan Lingxiu could not imagine how strong one's body and mind must be to be able to withstand all of this. It's really him. It's really him. Shangguan Lingxiu murmured with tears streaming down her cheeks. In fact, Shangguan Lingxiu had long suspected Supreme Cloud's identity, especially when the Eclipse Panther had come to report the news. Supreme Cloud was in the room just a door away. The Supreme Cloud in the dream did not conceal his real voice. Shangguan Lingxiu could tell who the original owner of the voice was. The Supreme Cloud who had always helped her, the Shangguan family of generals, the Empire of Yutong. The one who had been calm and composed in the face of the generals from the 4 countries was young Master Yun. Young Marquis Yun. The young Master Yun who always looked clean, as if no dust could ever land on him. That gentle and refined smile, that upright back view, although he was known as a popinjay in the outside world. If one were to investigate carefully, one would only realize that there seemed to be no popinjay deeds that could be related to Yutong's popinjay leader, young Master Yin. No matter how glib his words were, she had never seen him bend his back even once, no matter when or where. The young Master Yin who looked at her and called her sister Lingxiu, with a faint smile. It's him. It's really him. Shangguan Lingxiu finally understood, and understood a lot. No wonder I've always felt that Yun Yang has a lot of secrets. It's as if I can never get to the bottom of him. I can never understand what he's thinking, what he's pursuing, what he's aspiring for. No wonder I've always felt that this person is scheming, and has never shown his true feelings. Even when he's laughing and cursing, even when he's throwing a tantrum, even when he's being unreasonable. However, everything was so illusory and unreal. It seemed that no matter what others saw, it wasn't the real him. So that's how it is. The yin yang in the eyes of the world is only an illusion, a complete illusion. Young brother Yin Yang is Supreme Cloud. He is the Lord Supreme Wind whom the entire empire of Yutong regards as a god, the only savior. Along the way, he had so many things weighing on his heart. How could he be relaxed? How could he show his true feelings? It was just that with so many things on his shoulders, he believed that if it was anyone else, most of them would have already collapsed from the pressure. However, he could still be as gentle as jade. No one could tell that he was at ease. However, deep in his bones, he was so lonely and cold that no one could understand him. No one could share his burden, not even a little. If it were not for the fact that he was on the verge of collapsing from exhaustion, who would have thought that he was actually Supreme Cloud? Chapter 447. Shangguan Lingxiu could only feel her heart trembling. Lord Supreme Cloud. In the room. Suddenly, there was a loud thud. It was as if someone was sleeping and dreaming, but for some reason, they suddenly fell off the bed. Then there was no more sound. Shangguan Lingxiu's heart skipped a beat as she wiped her tears away quickly. Almost at the same time, the door finally opened with a squeak. Supreme Cloud's silhouette was still the same as when she had last seen him in Zilong City. He walked out calmly, his expression calm and his gaze sharp. Only his aura was as gentle and peaceful as ever, as if he had just woken up from a normal nap. He was brimming with energy and vigor. The uncontrollable hysteria in the dream could not be seen at all. As Supreme Cloud opened the door, he was not surprised to see Shangguan Lingxiu sitting on a chair a few feet away from him. Her face was propped up by her hand as if she was dozing off. In fact, Yun Yang dared not continue sleeping because he had sensed someone at the door. However, he could not help being stunned when he saw that it was Shangguan Lingxiu. Why are you here, Lady Shangguan? Aren't you resting? Shangguan Lingxiu smiled. I've received many messages from the spiritual beasts, so I went down to make some arrangements. I was really busy for a while. Lord Supreme Cloud has just woken up when I've just returned. Did you have a good sleep, Lord Supreme Cloud? Yin Yang coughed and said with a smile, I've never felt so good before. He mused and said, Did Lady Shangguan hear anything when you were here just now? I seem to have heard someone shouting in my sleep just now. Shangguan Lingxiu was taken aback and said, Someone shouted? Yin Yang nodded. No. Maybe it's just an illusion of me being in a dream. He smiled and said, "This time, the Shangguan family of generals has finally gotten what they wanted. General Wudi's remains have been returned, and his wish is fulfilled. However, I still have something to attend to. When I return to Tiantang, I'm afraid I won't be able to congratulate you personally. I apologize in advance." Shangguan Lingxiu smiled and said, "The Shangguan family will always remember Lord Supreme Cloud's kindness." Yin Yang waved his hand dismissively. "Forget it now. It's just something I did along the way. There's no need to worry about it." Shangguan Lingxiu did not want to linger on the topic, so she said kindly, "Sir, you must be hungry after sleeping for so long. What would you like to eat? I'll arrange for someone to do it immediately." Yin Yang's eyes flashed as he said slowly, "Is there cabbage and tofu on the ship? I want to make a dish by myself." "Tofu with cabbage?" Shangguan Lingxiu was visibly taken aback when she heard the name of the dish. Supreme Cloud had proposed to cook it himself in such a serious manner, but the ingredients were extremely common: cabbage and tofu. It would have been unexpected and unimaginable if anyone knew about it. Yes, cabbage, a common dish that could be stored well, was naturally stocked on the ship. Although tofu was not a common ingredient on the ship, the Shangguan family of generals was well prepared for this trip, and there seemed to be tofu in the storeroom. Shangguan Lingxiu paused and said, "I'll ask someone to make it for you right away." Shangguan Lingxiu's suggestion was a decision she had made after much deliberation. Yin Yang had said that he wanted to cook personally, but what he was making was the most common: cabbage and tofu. Perhaps he was using the most common ingredients and the most common taste to disguise his identity, or perhaps he was being cautious of himself. Or perhaps he was just like Shangguan Lingxiu, who did not know how to cook at all, and had no choice but to make a cabbage and tofu to appease his hunger, continuing his disguise to the end. Shangguan Lingxiu, who felt that she understood Yin Yang's feelings and loved him even more, naturally wanted to help Yin Yang. She would personally supervise the chef later. The Chinese cabbage and tofu made by the chef would surely taste better than Lord Supreme Cloud, who did not seem to know how to cook. Yin Yang said slowly, "I said that I want to make it myself. I want to make this dish myself." "You're really going to make it yourself?" Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes widened. "You know how to cook?" Yin Yang smiled faintly. "I don't really know how to make other dishes, but this one." Shangguan Lingxiu watched in amazement from the side, watching as Lord Yun worked personally and busied himself. First, it was the 2 cabbages that had been carefully selected. Yin Yang peeled off all the leaves on the outer layer, leaving only a small ball of tender cabbage core on the innermost layer. Then, he carefully peeled the tender core piece by piece and washed it with clean water, using the holy water charm. Then he began the next step, cutting the meat, adding oil, seasoning, and so on. Basically, he had to think carefully about every step before he took action. Shangguan Lingxiu was growing more curious about a certain someone's actions. Yin Yang's every step seemed to be orderly, yet each step was like a pilgrimage. It was unprecedentedly solemn, serious, and meticulous. Each step was like a fixed program, not a single strand out of place. As the ingredients were placed into the wok and simmered, the aroma wafted out. Yin Yang closed his eyes at the right time and sniffed lightly, saying in an intoxicated tone, "It smells so good." Was it good? Did Chinese cabbage and tofu not smell like this? Was there anything special about it? Although Shangguan Lingxiu was a girl, she did not know how to cook. She had rarely been in the kitchen, but she had tasted her fair share of delicacies. Still, she could not see anything special or unique about Yin Yang's Chinese cabbage and tofu. Could it be that the uniqueness did not lie in the cabbage but in the tofu? The cooking process had come to the last step. When the tofu was added, the aroma grew thicker. However, when the Chinese cabbage had completely melted in the wok, the fire was extinguished and the lid was put back on. After a while, the Chinese cabbage and tofu dish came to an end. Shangguan Lingxiu was still filled with curiosity. Even if it was a success, what was the uniqueness of this dish? Lord Supreme Cloud was treating it so seriously, with such fanfare, treating it with such seriousness and focus. There must be something different about this dish. Yun Yang was not in a hurry to put it on the plate. He was still carefully identifying the aroma of the dish. Was it exactly the same as the Chinese cabbage and tofu that old Dugu had made in his memory? Finally, he sighed in satisfaction. Although the Chinese cabbage and tofu he had cooked was still a little lacking compared to the delicacy in his memory, it was not too far off. He believed that he could recreate the flavor of the past if he cooked it a few more times. Do you have wine? Shangguan Lingxiu smiled and said, Of course. How can there be no wine on a ship filled with soldiers? Why don't I accompany Lord Supreme Cloud for a drink? If it had been before she knew about Supreme Cloud's true identity, Shangguan Lingxiu would never have suggested this. Now that she knew that Supreme Cloud was Yun Yang, she wanted to accompany her lover for a meal. A strange expression flashed across Yun Yang's face before it disappeared as quickly as it came. He said softly, I think I'll drink some myself. Shangguan Lingxiu was taken aback before she replied, All right. She was surprised. Could this Chinese cabbage and tofu have some sort of rare history? What past was it tied to? Now his gaze, expression, and temperament were really very strange. It was as if he was filled with an indescribable emotion. Yun Yang drank a mouthful of wine and ate a mouthful of Chinese cabbage and tofu. Every mouthful he took seemed to be meaningful in Shangguan Lingxiu's eyes. Yun Yang ate the whole afternoon of the huge pot of Chinese cabbage and tofu. He ate quietly on the wavering ship. His back was facing Shangguan Lingxiu, a dreamy glint flashing across his eyes from time to time. Just like that, the afternoon passed by quietly. Yun Yang was unusually quiet throughout the meal. Other than taking a mouthful of food and a sip of wine, he did not care about anything else. Whether it was the Nine Heavens dictum's message or anything else, he paid no attention to it. Shangguan Lingxiu felt that he was performing a solemn ritual that did not allow anyone or anything else to interfere. Finally, he was done. Yun Yang exhaled a long breath and said quietly, Thank you. Shangguan Lingxiu watched him eat the entire afternoon, starving, but she did not feel the passage of time at all. She asked curiously, Lord Supreme Cloud, this Chinese cabbage and tofu, is there a reason behind it? Yun Yang wore a forlorn smile and said, There's no reason. It's just that. This is the most delicious dish I've ever eaten in my life. It's also my favorite dish. That's all. The most delicious dish. His favorite dish. Was that all? Shangguan Lingxiu made a mental note of it and said seriously, I'll cook for Lord Supreme Cloud when I'm free next time. Yun Yang smiled. Sure, I'll be sure to trouble you if there's a chance. He slowly stood up and said, Time really passes in the blink of an eye. A day has passed just like that. It's really too fast. I have to rush back immediately. Your ship is moving too slowly. I have to go first. Shangguan Lingxiu said sincerely, Lord Supreme Cloud, take care on your journey. Yin Yang nodded and soared into the sky without another word. With a swoosh, the colorful clouds in the sky gathered, and the wind blew. A cloud floated away from the ship's bow. Yutong is at war. Everyone, let us meet again on the battlefield. A howl echoed, but the silhouette in the sky had already disappeared without a trace. The 8,000 warriors below looked up at the same time, feeling an inexplicable sense of excitement. Lord Supreme Cloud was actually on their ship? Had he been traveling with them for so long? Along the way, Yun Yang had sent a few orders to Shui Wuyin. Search for the famous assassin, ace cultivator Ouyang Xiaosh's whereabouts at all costs. Assist Yutong's military in sending messages at all costs. Ensure the smooth flow of military intelligence. Mobilize the people at all costs. Protect my home and protect my homeland. Spread the news that Yutong's Supreme Cloud is already on the battlefield. Shui Wuyin, who had been anticipating the news of a certain someone's return, was rendered speechless. Big brother, it's not easy for you to send a message back, but there are 3 pieces of information. No matter how I persuade you, you have to do your best at all costs. Can't you come up with something else? Is your vocabulary that lacking? Although he understood Yin Yang's feelings, the prefixes of the 3 pieces of information were exactly the same. It was as if they were of equal importance. What kind of statement was that? However, Shui Wuyin was still more capable of self-analysis, analyzing the sequence of the 3 pieces of information on his own. Assisting Yutong's military had to be the top priority no matter what. This was an urgent matter. There could be no obstruction or delay. Then he would mobilize the people to protect their own homes. Only by working together could they overcome this crisis. These two pieces of information were actually a series of actions that came along with the flow. As for Ouyang Xiaosh's news, it was placed at the end of the list. It was already a time of crisis. Relevant clues, especially when it was a relatively unfamiliar name, had to be temporarily shelved. It would not be too late to search for this person's tracks when Yutong's war was averted. As for the news that Supreme Cloud had already gone to the battlefield, Shui Wuyin had already released the news before Yun Yang had issued the order. Halfway through his journey back to the east, Yun Yang was surprised to see the empire of Zio's army retreating from the front line like a long dragon. It was an army that was already halfway to the battlefield, waiting to reinforce it. Further ahead, there were many more troops who were setting up camp and packing up. It looked like the empire of Zio was really going to withdraw from the four-nation siege this time. Since this was the case, Yun Yang did not waste any more time on the empire of Zio's side. He took a detour to the southern border and rushed to reinforce it. Compared to the northern battlefield, Yun Yang was relatively more assured about Taizheng. Since he was going to reinforce, he had to make a round trip before returning. If he were to travel in a straight line, the time would be much shorter, but he would inevitably waste a lot of places that could be taken care of. When Yun Yang arrived at the southern border, the war between Dayuan and Yutong had already erupted. The battle was intense and unusually brutal. The marshal of Yutong's southern border, who was facing the empire of Dayuan's massive military force, was Leng Daoyin's eldest son, Leng Shan. The southern border's marshal Leng Shan was at a critical juncture where he was overwhelmed and flustered. Leng Shan's military talent and cultivation, strategy and tactics were not inferior to the other party. No, it should be said that Leng Shan's military talent was not inferior to anyone in this world. In the past, it was only because he was the son of Yutong's marshal Leng Daoyin that his reputation was slightly inferior to that of Fu Baogua, Yang Buotao and Taizheng. With such a capable general holding the fort, the southern border should be worry-free. The truth was, as it was said, those who were good at fighting did not have much merit. There were almost no urgent reports from the southern border because of this young Marshal Leng. However, the situation this time was different, completely different. Young Marshal Leng, who could not cook without rice, only had a total of 300,000 soldiers at his disposal. 300,000 soldiers sounded like a lot, but they had to face the empire of Dayuan's 800,000 soldiers, who were attacking from multiple directions. Not only was the situation not optimistic, it was perilous. The disparity in military strength had caused them to be completely suppressed from the start of the battle. First, the 50,000 middle troops were suppressed on the front line, unable to move at all. Once they moved, it would definitely lead to the collapse of one side of the battle line. You could defeat one side, but how would you deal with the other three sides? If any one side was breached, it would be the beginning of a complete defeat. Leng Shan's lips were blistering. Facing the other party's frenzied attack, he could only use all his skills and counter every move that came his way. As for retaliating forcefully, he could not do it for the time being. This battle is completely different from the past. There's only one thing I can guarantee now. Leng Shan faced the group of generals and said coldly, "Before we are all dead, we will not allow the Dayuan army to take a single step into the southern border. Outside the gates of the country, this is the motto of the soldiers of the southern border, till death do us part." Every general had already written their wills and made arrangements for their deaths. In the face of such a dangerous situation, they no longer had the calmness of the past, because no one had the confidence to leave this battlefield alive. However, everyone had the same thought in their hearts. Before I die, I must kill a few more Dayuan soldiers. Killing only one would be a loss. It would not be worth it. This is my last order. Every soldier of the southern border, even if you have to die, you must kill at least 4 Dayuan soldiers before you die. Leng Shan's voice was cold. If we can do this, then we can still fight for the victory of the southern border. even if we have to perish together with the enemy. Even if we perish together, we swear to not lose the southern border." The soldiers raised their arms and cheered, their eyes filled with the color of blood. In the distance, the sound of a horn once again sounded shrilly. The Yuan's new wave of all-out attack had begun once again. "Fight!" Lung Shan's face was as hard as steel. "This battle may be the last for all of us. It is very likely that the command will not be smooth, so I hereby give my last order. Every unit fight on your own. Fight to the death. Even if the commanding general dies in battle, the army will not fall into chaos. The deputy general will immediately be promoted to the commanding general. If the deputy general dies in battle, the deputy general will take his place. So on and so forth, rank by rank. My request to all of you is, even if your army is left with only 10 people, you must not fall into chaos. You must not fall. Fight. Fight, fight, fight. Even if we are bathed in blood, we must ensure that the front line does not fall." The generals shouted in unison, their voices extremely fierce. However, just as they turned around and were about to stride out of the commander's tent, an unforeseen event suddenly happened. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The wind around them began to howl inexplicably. Right now, the normal wind was from the south. Yutong's army was in a position where it was against the wind. The first two factors were disadvantageous to them, but now, the southerly wind that had been howling just a moment ago had suddenly turned into a howling northerly wind. That wasn't all. The wind was getting stronger and stronger, as if it was getting stronger and stronger. Even though it was the middle of winter, and it was normal for the north wind to blow, such a change in the weather was extremely abnormal. Lung Shan watched as the marshal's flag fluttered abnormally. Suddenly, a thought struck him as he exclaimed in delight. Could it be? As if his words had awakened them from their dreams, a strong sense of hope appeared in the eyes of all the generals present. The wind has changed. Could it be that the 9 Supremes Lords have arrived? Just thinking about it made everyone's blood boil, and they were indescribably excited. Everyone knew that the most dangerous part of the war was the eastern front line. Han San's army was pressing down on the border. Although Fu Baogua had the geographical advantage, his total military strength was far from the enemy's. The war was dire. Once the eastern front line was breached, the country would be in danger of annihilation. The southern border, on the other hand, was the most stable side in the past. It was also the side that the 9 Supremes had sent the least amount of reinforcements. Therefore, no one had expected the 9 Supremes to appear on the southern border. What was more, there was only 1 9 Supremes Lords left now. They could not afford to be distracted at all. Therefore, the generals had not held out much hope for the 9 Supremes reinforcements. The 9 Supremes Lords should have appeared in the eastern defense. Now, in the midst of life and death and defeat, they were pleasantly surprised to learn that the 9 Supremes had arrived. Lung Shan was the first to sprint out. Standing in the open space, he looked up at the sky. Observing the movements around him, he confirmed it again and again. The northern wind was howling louder and louder, its sound growing more forlorn. Countless tree branches were actually snapped off and flew over from an unknown place, crashing into the Deyuan army on the other side. At the same time, the snow and ice on the ground began to melt bit by bit amidst the howling northern wind. After a while, the Deyuan army suddenly lit up as far as the eye could see. It was as if a single spark had started a prairie fire. After a few dozen breaths, the sparks had already turned into a sea of fire that swept towards the south. Lung Shan could instantly tell that it was Deyuan's army's tents, barracks, and supplies. They were all engulfed by the sea of fire. Amidst the blazing flames, dark clouds once again covered the sky. Amidst the dark clouds, the god of thunder beat the war drum, as if he was playing along. Thunder and lightning were about to descend to the mortal world, like a lightning punishment from the heavens, wreaking havoc in the mortal world. It really is the 9 Supremes Lords. Lung Shan was overjoyed at the sight of the natural disasters wreaking havoc in Deyuan's base. He raised his arms and shouted, "Change of strategy. Attack with all troops, counterattack with all our might. We will not return without victory." Chapter 448. The sonorous sound of a horn rang out as the war drums of the entire military base thumped loudly. Someone was shouting crazily, "The 9 Supremes Lords are here. The Marshal has ordered the entire army to attack and counterattack. We will not return until we win. Attack! Attack! We will not return until we win." On the other side, De Yuan's camp was in a state of complete chaos. Many of the generals wore expressions of despair and dejection. Victory was right in front of them, and the golden opportunity to break through the southern border's defense was within reach. Why had the 9 Supremes come? The empire of De Yuan's marshal stared blankly at the raging northern wind in the sky, the sparks around him, and the lightning bolts in the sky. Suddenly, he spat out a mouthful of blood. "Isn't this a trap?" he mumbled in a daze. "Didn't the empire of Zio say that they've trapped Supreme Cloud? Are they about to annihilate the 9 Supremes? Why would Supreme Cloud suddenly appear here? Why is this happening? If you can't trap him, you should have said so earlier. Now that he's here, his manifestation powers are even more powerful than the 9 Supremes' combined power. Won't the lives of hundreds of thousands of Empire of De Yuan's disciples be buried in the false information? This is... You should have said so earlier. You could have said so earlier. If you had, this old man would have set up a formation to defend against the 9 Supremes' attack. Even if we still couldn't defend ourselves, we wouldn't have suffered such a heavy loss like we are now." It was at this moment that the situation continued to develop in a direction that was not in the Empire of De Yuan's favor. The color of blood suddenly lit up. All the soldiers of the Empire of De Yuan who had been injured before, without exception, felt the blood in their bodies boiling for some reason. It even gushed out from their wounds like a spring. Even those with better physiques would feel extremely weak. As for those with weaker physiques, those who had lost too much blood would immediately die in the blood bank. At least thousands of soldiers had perished because of this. As the northern wind continued to howl, the fire that rose from De Yuan's base grew more and more unstoppable. It soared into the sky and spread towards the south. Behind them, Yutong's army seemed to be aided by God as they charged forward energetically, their morale soaring to an unprecedented level. Just as Yutong's army charged forward and their fighting spirit was at its peak, the northern wind surged once more. As a result, the De Yuan army, who was in a disadvantageous position, did not even have the chance to engage in battle. They were already blown so hard by the northern wind that they could not even open their eyes. How could they possibly defend themselves against the attacks of the snow-white blades? Great spears and long swords flashed with a cold glint, and wherever they passed, blood splattered everywhere. In a single breath, the boundless sea of fire spread out for almost 1,000 miles. Faced with the attacks of the countless anomalies, the combat power of the De Yuan army was reduced to a freezing point. As a matter of fact, the number of casualties among the De Yuan army was not that high. At the very least, compared to the total number of soldiers in the army of 800,000, the number of casualties was far from enough to cause the entire army to collapse. In spite of this, the sudden appearance of the power of heaven and earth, the power of nature, and the name of the 9 Supremes made De Yuan's army lose the will to fight. Almost from the very beginning, the process of defeat had begun. The northern wind blew strongly, the flames filled the sky, thunder and lightning intersected, and the color of blood filled the sky. In the following 2 days and 2 nights, De Yuan's army could only be in a state of collapse, a state of utter defeat. When De Yuan's army could finally reorganize their military forces, they were shocked to realize that they had already retreated more than 800 miles away. "Don't move, reorganize everyone. We have lost this battle. Yutong's morale is high. We must be wary of the enemy's pursuit. Be careful." Yutong's side was filled with thunderous cheers. Everyone was so excited that their chests felt like they were about to explode. Everyone had thought that they were going to die for their country in this battle. But who would have thought that the 9 Supremes would suddenly arrive and turn their obvious defeat into a great victory? Lung Shan stood at the highest point of the military camp and shouted, "Lord Supreme Wind, Lung Shan and all my brothers thank you for your help. I wonder if Lord Supreme Wind can come down for a chat?" Zio's news had yet to reach here. So Lung Shan still thought that the person in front of him was Lord Supreme Wind, and no one else. Once he spoke, the entire battlefield was silent, waiting for the person in the sky to appear. All the warriors lifted their heads, gazing at the sky with excitement and longing. They wondered if Lord Supreme Wind could come down for a chat. The wind and clouds in the sky surged as a silhouette appeared quietly among the clouds. The eastern border is in an emergency. I must rush over as soon as possible. Marshal Lung has always guarded the southern border without negligence. As long as we don't advance rashly, the southern border will be safe. Brothers of the southern border, we shall meet again when Marshal Lung returns to the capital. The cheers were thunderous. It's a promise, Lord Supreme Wind is mighty. The sound of the wind rose again, as Lord Supreme Wind's silhouette disappeared. The gale billowed as it sped towards the northeast, its momentum shaking the heavens. Brothers, it's up to us now. Lung Shan shouted excitedly. Lord Supreme Wind has already laid the foundation for our victory. If we still lose this battle, we might as well hang ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be a laughing stock. Ha ha ha. The generals guffawed. This time, we'll definitely beat De Yuan's children until they run away. High up in the sky, Yun Yang, who had turned into a breeze, was sprinting at full speed. The wind howled, sharp as a knife. Whitey Three's legs had long been reattached, but its injuries had yet to heal, so it was still very weak. The current situation was very different from before. Yun Yang, who had recovered his manifestation powers, naturally would not use the two Whitey's gliding ability. Instead, he nurtured the two Whitey's physical bodies with the air of vitality as he traveled, hugging them in his arms. The southern border's war was unexpectedly smooth. The crisis of the southern border had been resolved with just one battle. There were no other worries, so of course, Yun Yang was happy. To be fair, Yun Yang had not expected the matter to be resolved so easily. De Yuan's army had actually formed a 10-sided cylindrical formation that relied purely on their advantage in military strength, allowing Yun Yang's power of wind and fire to be put to good use. With such a change in the situation, De Yuan must have already known that Supreme Cloud is trapped in Zio. That's why the generals have launched such an unbridled attack. Other than Supreme Cloud's inability to come to help, it's also because young Marshal Lung's defensive prowess is renowned in the world. To break through his defense in the shortest time possible, it's indeed best to use such an advantageous military force to seal off all four sides and attack, without regard for the cost. However, my sudden arrival has changed the situation, leading to this unexpected yet reasonable defeat. Does this mean that Zio has helped me? Yun Yang was rather amused by the thought. Yun Yang's speculation was basically in line with the truth. This was the only reason that could explain De Yuan's marshal, who had led troops for his entire life, making such a foolish arrangement. Of course, there was also the fact that Yun Yang's manifestation powers had improved tremendously. In the past, even when there were 9 Supremes reinforcements, there would not be more than 4 or more of the 9 Supremes gathered on one side. Now, however, Yun Yang himself was equivalent to 6 of the 9 Supremes, and his manifestation powers had far surpassed the power that Supreme Wind, Flame, and the others could unleash. The combination of his manifestation powers had greatly surpassed the previous 9 Supremes' immense power. It was also the key to turning the tide of this war around. Although we've won this war, it's still a fact that Yutong's national strength is gradually weakening. Yun Yang was worried. The southern border is the side that Yutong has suffered the least casualties throughout the years. That's why there are 300,000 soldiers. However, other than these 300,000 southern border troops, the other reinforcements, including those who are still on the way, don't exceed 100,000 men. It's really difficult to help the overall situation. The country is at a critical juncture. The moment of survival has finally arrived. Now, only the eastern defense can be stabilized and Han Sanha's troops will be defeated. Yutong will then have at least 5 years of recuperation. Yun Yang's gaze turned even colder as he made up his mind. Amidst the raging wind and clouds he sped up. However, just as Yun Yang was moving at his maximum speed, an inexplicable sense of danger rose from the bottom of his heart. Yun Yang stopped abruptly. In the next moment, The cloud manifestation that was riding on the wind dispersed abruptly, turning into wisps of cool breeze. Although the cloud manifestation had form but no substance, it was still tangible and traceable. It was not as good as the wind manifestation, which had truly blended into heaven and earth, and could not be seen by the naked eye. Yun-yang had long been prepared for the enemy's ambush. The reason was very simple. It was because the journey back home had been too smooth, so smooth that it was unexpected and even unreasonable. In fact, Yun-yang had been waiting ever since he had left Zilong City. His sudden attack in Zilong City could be said to have been an abrupt change. The Four Seasons Tower's Mr. Nian might not have been able to make it in time, due to the unexpected turn of events. This was still within reason and understandable. However, when he had gone on a killing spree and charged out of Zilong City for a few days, there was still no movement. This was not normal. In the eyes of an ordinary person, this was a long distance that would require half a year's journey. But for a peerless cultivator like Mr. Nian, who possessed earth-shattering skills, it would not take long. He had been racing to the southern border and had fought the war, but the other party had yet to appear. There must be something fishy about this. Therefore he was on high alert. It was not a surprise that a threat had arrived. It could only be summed up in 4 words. He had indeed come. That was all. Yun-yang dared not be negligent. He retracted his cloud manifestation and turned into a breeze, concealing himself completely. Only then did he carefully examine his surroundings. Beneath him was a forest that stretched on endlessly. Snow fluttered in the air, blanketing the area in silver. The forest rose and fell, stretching on endlessly. There did not seem to be anything out of the ordinary that he could see. In spite of this, the sense of danger in Yun-yang's heart did not diminish. Instead, it grew stronger. The whistling wind stopped as Yun-yang stared ahead deep in thought. If there was danger, the source of the danger must be in the space in front of him. However, there was nothing out of the ordinary in this space. Could it be that there's another spiritual restraining formation ahead? But this isn't possible, is it? Yun-yang frowned. The speed of my wind and cloud manifestation is unparalleled in this world. No one can surpass me. Besides, I've unexpectedly rushed to the southern border first. My tracks are hard to predict. After taking such a big detour, who can catch up to me and set up a spiritual restraining formation on a path that I must pass through without any prior signs? What's more, it's above such a huge stretch of forest. If it's not a spiritual restraining formation, what kind of dangerous trap is there? It can't be a direct kill, can it? With my current ability and cultivation base, as long as my manifestation powers aren't sealed, even if Mr. Nian were to attack me personally, he might not be able to do anything to me. Yun-yang pondered. Speaking from the bottom of his heart, Yun-yang had always been extremely confident in his manifestation powers. However, when he had caught a glimpse of Mr. Nian's technique against Lei Dongtian from afar, it was truly breathtaking. He was 30% fearful, 30% and 40% surprised by its unfathomable prowess. It was at this moment that a sharp sword energy suddenly soared into the sky, coming straight for him. Yun-yang did not even have the time to sense where the sword energy had come from. The moment he realized it, the sword chi had already covered the sky and the earth, and the surprise attack had already arrived. The sword energy whistled as the abundant sword energy crushed everything within the space where Yun-yang was. Even the shapeless wind and the shapeless clouds were torn apart. Even though Yun-yang had already turned into a breeze, he could not help but grunt. The power of this sneak attack was actually able to harm the wind and clouds. Yun-yang's manifestation could clearly feel that he had been injured amidst this wave of sword light and sword waves. Furthermore, this kind of sword chi had a very strange, or perhaps it could be said to have a very strange power. It was as if it had an inexplicable control over the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. To be more precise, it was a vague tendency to engulf it. It was only at this moment that Yun-yang was truly shocked. What cultivation method was this? How could it possess such an unfathomable power? How could there be such a sword energy in this world? Not only could it engulf spiritual chi, it could even produce an engulfing effect on his manifested form of wind and cloud. Even when he had completely turned into a breeze, he was still vaguely pulled by it. Amidst the shock, Yun-yang scrutinized it carefully, and was even more shocked to realize that the strange sword energy was not only engulfing spiritual qi and interfering with the manifestation of wind and cloud, it could also cause considerable damage to his soul. Yun-yang had never encountered such a thing before. After the sword light flashed, it disappeared without a trace. Yun-yang had used all his deific consciousness, but he still did not see how the sword light had disappeared. It was obvious that the other party's art of sword manipulation had reached the pinnacle of swordsmanship, the acme of perfection. Chapter 449. Yun-yang inched forward as carefully as he could, trying his best to conform to the nature of the breeze that he was currently in. His body and mind were fully immersed in the nature of heaven and earth, drifting forward as gently as he could. Anyone or anything that came into contact with Yun-yang at such a close, or even negative distance, would not feel anything out of the ordinary. The breeze that brushed past could be felt but left no trace. That was how it should be. Therefore, Yun-yang thought that he should be in a state of divine distance. Then, there was no more movement below, and the other party was nowhere to be seen. It was not as thorough as Yun-yang, whether it was the person, the sword, the aura, the deific consciousness, or even the attack. It was as if they did not exist at all. Only the instinctive sense of danger that originated from a cultivator was still present. Yun-yang knew that the crisis was far from over. The quieter it was now, the more dangerous it was. If he were to let his guard down for even a moment, it would be the moment of his demise. Maintaining the state of divine distance, he drifted forward for about a dozen miles. Suddenly, Yun-yang felt like he had bumped into something. Perhaps he had come into contact with something unusual. It was as if there was an invisible barrier that connected heaven and earth, blocking him within a certain range. He had come into contact with the edge of that range, and thus he had touched it. The moment Yun-yang came into contact with the barrier, he knew that something was amiss. He immediately turned into a stream of wind with a swoosh, the manifestation of the wind retreating 1,000 feet away. Almost at the same time as Yun-yang moved, another bizarre sword light appeared out of nowhere, slicing the space that he had come into contact with into pieces. Everything in that space was annihilated at once. Shockingly, a black hole was slowly repairing itself. Yun-yang let out another soft grunt in his heart. Although he had reacted in time and dispersed swiftly, he could not help but be slightly affected by the sword energy, causing his soul to feel waves of excruciating pain that felt like it was being sliced apart. At the same time, his mind was filled with a hazy feeling. His internal organs were churning as well, as if they were on fire. The damage caused to him by this sword was much more intense than the previous one. His body, mind, divine sense, and divine soul had all been attacked. Yun-yang even suspected that the strange sword energy was designed to target his manifestation. It was not aimed at the physical body, but only at the soul, causing the soul to backfire on his body and mind, and even indirectly injure his physical body. Such power was truly terrifying. Yun-yang's alarmed heart had been raised to another level. The sword light seemed to have succeeded, but it also seemed to have failed. It didn't linger on the spot, but disappeared again, as if it didn't exist. It was as if it had melted into the air. From beginning to end, no one could see where it came from, or where it was going. This scene was extremely strange and indescribable. The sense of danger that Yun-yang felt grew stronger than before. Yun-yang climbed swiftly. He was at least 10,000 feet above the ground, but even at such a high altitude, he could still clearly feel the sense of danger following him like a parasite. Even if it was only for a moment, it did not leave him. Yun-yang grumbled inwardly. Yun-yang had never been someone who would give up easily. Otherwise, he would not have taken the risk to go there despite knowing that there was a spiritual restraining formation in Zilong City. He would not have chosen to bluff and threaten Zio's emperor and officials to take back the Niello Bear's mystical core despite knowing the limits of his ability. There were too many similar examples. However, Yun-yang really did not know how to deal with it now. The ability of this person who was lurking in the dark before him, was not something that he could fight against. To Yin Yang's knowledge, his strength was even more powerful than Ling Xiaozui's back then. Could it be that Mr. Nian had come personally? However, how could Mr. Nian be so strong? What kind of standard was this? Could it be that his estimation of Ling Xiaozui's ability had been wrong? It should be so. It was just like how he had thought that Old Bai was very strong. But Old Bai, who was already at the 6th level of Heaven Realm, was still no match for Jun Moyan's sword. It seemed that ignorance was bliss. Just as Yin Yang's thoughts were drifting, the strange sword light attacked again. Just like before, it flashed by and didn't stop. Then it disappeared. Once again, Yin Yang felt that his divine soul was affected. Yin Yang made a quick calculation. The other party seemed to have used some unknown method to know that he was within this space. Now the other party's sword force had completely locked down a radius of about 50,000 feet. This was undoubtedly a vast area. However, the other party's sword, speed, and force could ignore the distance between them. It could appear wherever it wanted to. If he continued to stay here, he might be killed by the other party in the next moment. There was no chance of luck in this. Even if he could transform into thousands of clones, with the other party's skill, if 10 strikes were not enough, 100 strikes would not be enough. Under the continuous attacks, he could always be fatally wounded. Finally, he could no longer maintain his wind manifestation. It was Yin Yang's first time encountering such a situation. Despite the fear in his heart, he could not just sit and wait to be captured. Thus, he began to think anxiously about how he could escape and get himself out of this dangerous situation. Right now, the most critical thing was still the geographical advantage. The other party had set up a strange barrier to restrict him within a certain area. He had to change this flaw to improve the current situation. But how could he do it? The wind was flowing towards the northeast now. If he changed the direction of the wind abruptly, there would definitely be an anomaly. The moment he changed, he might be caught and killed by the other party. If he turned into a cloud and left, it would most likely be the same. Blood, water, fire. These few aspects would not do. None of them would do. There was also the lightning manifestation. The speed of the lightning manifestation was indeed faster than the wind, but the consumption was too intense, and the target was obvious. Even if he really turned into lightning, he would still be killed by the other party with a snap of his fingers. Helpless, Yin Yang could only maintain his slow drifting trajectory, drifting towards the south. Yin Yang's movement was not without reason. The south was the closest to the ground, and the highest spot of the mountain below. The enemy should be right here, riding his sword and pointing it at him. If he drifted north, he could stay away from the enemy, but it would definitely be the direction that the enemy was most concerned about. The more dangerous a place is, the safer it is. Now that I'm at my wit's end, I can only take the risk and do the opposite. Yin Yang continued to move south carefully. This time, he turned himself into thousands of wisps of wind and quietly separated himself from the barrier. Below, the sword light moved again. It flashed like before, and another space that was close to the barrier was instantly torn apart. This time, however, it did not affect Yin Yang at all. The sword light was aimless, and it was the first time Yin Yang was unharmed. However, the sword light did not vanish. Instead, it flashed 3 more times. Thousands of feet of space close to the north were torn into 3 large black holes almost at the same time. If Yin Yang had been within the range of these 3 black holes, even if he did not die, his wind manifestation would dissipate, and he would be gravely injured. It could be said that Yin Yang's decision to continue moving thousands of feet to the south in this short period of time was extremely wise. The 3 lightning-fast swords did not cause him any harm. Even so, Yin Yang was still shaken by the swords, shuddering in fear. The astonishing might of these swords, especially when he personally witnessed it, was truly hard to describe the soul-stirring feeling he felt. Yin Yang did not even notice where the sword light came from, or where it would eventually return to, even though he was watching from the sidelines. This was simply an inconceivable miracle. With Yin Yang's current cultivation base, and the standard of ascending to the heaven realm, although he was still not considered top-notch, the average 10th perfection grandmaster, was no longer a match for a single strike of his saber. The battle in Zilong City had already proven this point. In spite of this, he still could not find even the slightest trace of this opponent he was facing now. If Yin Yang's wind manifestation were to be broken, he would probably be dismembered and die in the next instant. His soul would be destroyed as well, and he would be doomed eternally. He would be as dead as he could possibly be. After a few futile attacks in the north, the strange sword light suddenly paused for a breath's time, as if it was considering something. With a sudden thought, Yin Yang hurriedly maneuvered his wind manifestation to move to the north once more. His current position was where the void had been torn apart by the 3 consecutive slashes just now. Sure enough, as soon as he started to move, the strange and inexplicable sword light, with terrifying destructive power, flashed several times from the north to the south in the space of thousands of feet. It was obvious that Yin Yang's guess was right. The owner of the sword light had predicted Yin Yang's thoughts and countermeasure after his consecutive attacks failed. So he struck again without hesitation. If Yin Yang had been slightly slower, he would not have been able to avoid the series of attacks. While Yin Yang was still terrified, a sliver of delight rose in his heart. He had seen a turning point, or rather, the key to the outcome of this battle. Mr. Nian's wisdom is unparalleled, and his strategy is profound. He's obviously confirmed that I'm in this area, so he'll definitely try his best to kill me. He won't miss this golden opportunity. However, it's one thing for him to confirm that I'm here, but it's another matter to lock onto my actual location. His continuous attacks from the north just now were not meant to kill, but to probe. When he noticed that something was amiss, he would definitely clear the area around him. Therefore, the area around him has become the most dangerous place again. Therefore, I've moved to the place where he attacked just now. This is the safest place right now. Yin Yang was thinking nervously. But what will he do after wiping out the south? How should I make use of the fact that he can't pinpoint my actual location? He's probably guessed that I'm hiding at the place where he attacked just now, which is why I'm temporarily safe. Then, after he sweeps through the space from the south to the south, should I continue heading north? Chapter 450. Yin Yang's thoughts spun rapidly. He's already gone from the south to the north, but he didn't find anything. He won't make the same mistake again. He'll only sweep the south again later. Therefore, the place he's swept through isn't safe anymore. I can't stay here anymore. Yin Yang steeled his heart. His wind manifestation continued to head north. The sword light flashed once more in the south, flashing a dozen times before it stopped. Yin Yang had already traveled almost 10,000 feet away. Seeing that the other party's attack had stopped, Yin Yang slowed down his movements as well. Looking from afar, the strange sword light continued to wreak havoc just as the movement in the south stopped. The time interval is too short. Mr. Nian is still suspicious of the other side. He's intelligent and adaptable. Yin Yang sighed subconsciously. The current situation was that Yin Yang had a chance to escape. As long as he could get 50,000 feet away from Mr. Nian's sword energy, Yin Yang would be able to escape unscathed. In spite of this, he would never be able to get out of this 50,000 feet radius of sword light in such a short period of time. As long as there was a mistake in judgment, or even if Mr. Nian had hit him by chance, the situation would take a turn for the worse. As for Mr. Nian, after sweeping the south for the second time, he changed the direction of his attack again. Yin Yang guessed that this time, it would be an all-encompassing indiscriminate attack. There was only one relatively safe place for such a move, the south that Mr. Nian had just swept through twice. Yin Yang moved swiftly, rushing towards the area that was being ravaged by the lingering sword light. This was a battle of wits. Both parties were highly intelligent. The only difference was that if Mr. Nian had guessed wrongly, Yin Yang would have a chance to escape. Still, it was only a chance. If Yin Yang had guessed wrongly, he would be targeted by Mr. Nian's sword light and turned into dust. Yin Yang's bet was his life. He was betting with his very life. On one hand, Yin Yang controlled his deific consciousness subtly, and was even more careful in his manifestation to ensure that he did not emit any suspicious aura. On the other hand, He was trying his best to avoid the lingering power of the sword energy. Almost like a moth flying into a flame, he rushed towards the atmosphere that was filled with remnant flames and embers. Furthermore, this wave of actions had to be fast. However, if he was too fast, he would be destroyed by the sword light the moment he crashed into it. If he was too slow, he would be smashed into the sword light net on the spot by Mr. Nian, who had turned around. His grasp of propriety had indeed reached an unimaginable level. On the other side, the lingering sword light was still shining like a silver snake. Yin Yang was already close to the edge of the black hole that had been sliced open by the sword light. It was as if the two of them had an appointment. Yin Yang stepped in, and the sword light disappeared. Yin Yang entered the area of the black hole unscathed. The space crackled as it gradually recovered. Yin Yang, who was in the state of a breeze, was inconspicuous. On the other side, the continuous, indiscriminate, and bizarre sword light attacks arrived as expected. Mr. Nian struck again. Even for Mr. Nian, this attack should be considered an all-out effort. Yin Yang could acutely sense that this might be his only chance of survival in this battle. It was at this moment that he suddenly changed his direction. Still trying his best not to make any noise, he dived down at full speed. If he were to remain high up in the sky, the other party would be able to force him out sooner or later. The only thing he could do now was to risk landing on the ground and shake off the suppression of the other party's high-altitude territory. Yin Yang plummeted to the ground like a meteor. Behind him, the sword light was still wreaking havoc. The snowflakes and dark clouds that were drifting down from the sky were torn into pieces as the sword light struck from every space. Thousands of sword lights and strands of sword chi were still mixed with long sword lights, and they flickered horizontally and vertically in the air. They rose and fell, and they seemed to be endless. Yin Yang was less than 500 feet from the ground when the sword light that was wreaking havoc in the air suddenly stopped. It had stopped without warning. Then, the sword light flashed again as it turned around and plunged downwards. With a loud boom, the accumulated thick snow on the ground rose into the air. Every snowflake turned into sharp sword energy with that loud boom. The land within a 10-mile radius was completely sliced apart. The attack was even more ferocious than before. The other party had actually guessed Yin Yang's current plan. Fortunately, Yin Yang had anticipated the change and was prepared for it at the same time. However, when he was personally hit by the wave of attack, Yin Yang still felt that his body was riddled with holes. It was worse than being sliced into pieces. There was no other reason, but the attack's range was too wide, and the attack was relatively concentrated. Of course, more importantly, Yin Yang was hit by the attack as expected. This was one of the keys to his escape from this battle. Yin Yang forcefully suppressed the urge to faint. As the attack landed quietly on the ground, he activated the holy water charm immediately. Many water droplets seemed to have melted due to the sudden change in the snow on the ground and fell into the layer of snow below. The sword energy in the sky continued to fall towards the forest. Almost every inch of land was flipped over by the continuous sword light. Anything that was hit by the sword light and sword energy, even a snowflake, was shattered into pieces. The trees that were covered in snow seemed to have encountered the greatest calamity in the world. Not a single one of them was spared. None of them were spared. An indifferent voice rang out for the first time. Supreme Cloud, I know you're in this snowfield. Yin Yang was currently under the layer of snow. Although he had seeped into the ground due to his water manifestation, he could still feel new wounds on his body. He held it in forcefully, allowing Amy's spatial spiritual force to replenish and repair his wounds without interruption. He was trying his best to keep himself from fainting due to his poor physical condition. As for the voices from the outside world, he ignored them completely. If he fainted now, everything would be over. You can say whatever you want. Since you're so capable, I'll let you run your mouth. The creaking of the snow outside indicated that someone had landed on the snowy ground and was currently walking over in a slow and graceful manner. The voice was still speaking freely. The voice was elegant and composed, containing an unparalleled authority that controlled the world and a sense of superiority over the common people. It was as if the person who was speaking had the power to decide the life and death of all living beings in this world. You're very smart. Even your spiritual sense is unusually sensitive. You can actually sense the impending danger in advance. This is something I admire very much. As the person spoke, there were still countless sword energy hissing out. Like Yin Yang had predicted, he could not pinpoint Yin Yang's exact location after his manifestation. But his attack range still encompassed Yin Yang. He was certain that Yin Yang's current location was within 50,000 feet of where he stood. Therefore, he had never struck out a single strike beyond this range. It was as if he was certain that this supreme cloud must be within the boundary he had drawn. That elegant voice continued to ring out, like two old friends chatting. Such spiritual sense is very precious. In my life, I've seen people with such spiritual sense. If they were martial artists, they would be unparalleled experts. If they were in the military, they would be peerless marshals. If they were in the bureaucracy, they would be famous officials. Such spiritual sense is the most precious gift God has given to mankind. It's irreplaceable. Actually, everyone basically has this kind of spiritual sense. They're born with it. However, looking at the entire world, those who can use this spiritual sense flexibly are definitely not more than 100 people since the beginning of time. As for today's world, they are as rare as phoenix feathers and unicorn horns. As for your second strength, it's intelligence. I've rarely seen a young man as intelligent, resourceful, scheming, and shrewd as you. You've done very well indeed. The sword light hissed. Having intelligence doesn't equate to being resourceful. Having intelligence and resourcefulness doesn't equate to being resourceful. Those who have all three may not necessarily be shrewd and scheming, but you have all of these. The Nine Supremes think tank lives up to his reputation. It's commendable that you could capture my people one by one and kill them one by one when you were still weak. However, what I value more is that you've ensured not to expose your true identity throughout the series of actions. Even I have to admit that I admire you for this. If I were in your shoes, I might not have the confidence to do what you've done. You're Supreme Cloud, the Nine Supremes think tank, but you've disguised yourself as Supreme Wind and Supreme Flame, reinvigorating your reputation with wind and fire. You've even hidden your true self in the mist, forsaking your name and disregarding your reputation. This alone isn't something that anyone can do. However, this isn't what I admire the most about you. Just now we only had a short exchange of blows. Although you didn't see me and I didn't see you, you had an accurate grasp of my mentality. You've been avoiding my blind spots, walking the line between life and death. Not only that, you could even make use of my blind spots to find an opportunity for yourself to escape. The gap between our cultivation bases is as wide as heaven and earth, but you could predict my every step and come to this. How rare! How rare indeed! Supreme Cloud, you're truly a genius. The elegant voice outside sighed, as if it was filled with pity for the Supreme Cloud it spoke of. In spite of this, the hissing sound of sword energy had never stopped throughout his long speech. During this period of time, Yun Yang felt that he had been brushed past by the sword energy at least a dozen times. Yes, it had merely brushed past, but it had already caused more severe damage to Yun Yang. The sword energy's point of origin was his soul. The excruciating pain that came from the soul went straight to the depths of his consciousness. It was more excruciating than an ordinary physical injury. So excruciating that it could not be any more agonizing. If I had a choice, I'd prefer to take you in as my assistant and not kill you. The voice outside sighed in melancholy. It's a pity that I have to kill you. Our standpoints are completely different, creating a deadlock. I wonder if you want to know why I must kill the Nine Supremes? Yin Yang's heart almost stopped beating when the question was tossed out. He almost blurted it out and questioned the person face to face. Because this was the biggest mystery in his heart. However, he dared not react at all now. The voice outside continued. The Nine Supremes and I have no enmity in the past or in the present. I've set up layers of traps and ambushed them at Tianxian Cliff, obviously intending to annihilate all of the Nine Supremes. How can there be no reason for this? I guess you must be very confused about this as well? Have you always been confused? The person outside seemed to be talking to himself. However, Yun Yang knew that this was a psychological attack. He was purposely talking about the things he was interested in, with the aim of triggering an unusual fluctuation in his soul, with the other party's profound cultivation base and divine means. As long as Yun Yang made any movement, he would be the first to notice it. By then, there would be no chance of survival, and he would die for sure. Yun Yang forcefully suppressed his thoughts, keeping his body still and unmoving. The voice continued elegantly. I know you understand what I mean, but you're obviously someone who knows how to control yourself. You're very rational, and know what's the right choice to make. Only then will you have a chance of survival. However, this reputed one wants to tell you that it's useless. You must be very curious as to how I can be sure that you're within this area. Including when we were high up in the sky just now, it was because I had confirmed your position, that you were within a certain area. That was why I attacked so brazenly, and limited the area of my attack. Aren't you curious about this? No matter how you hide, no matter how you compromise, I won't leave until you die. The person outside smiled faintly. As long as you're still alive, I can feel that this battle will not end until one of us dies. I know you're waiting for me to lose my patience, to doubt my own judgment, and to leave in disappointment. However, I want to tell you that your hope will never come true. Even if you don't move for a year, I'll stay here and guard for a year. The elegant voice outside said faintly, without the slightest hint of anger. There was even a hint of a smile in it. If 1 year isn't enough, then 10 years is fine. I can afford it. I really can afford it. So you have no luck in this battle. Even if you're wise and resourceful, you can't make up for the difference in ability. Supreme Cloud, if you come out now, I'll dispel all the doubts in your heart and let you die without regrets. On the other hand, if you persist in hiding and don't come out, there's only one outcome. To rot here with endless questions and regrets. To be left as a corpse. I believe you know who I am. You're right. The voice outside sneered. I'm the person you want to kill the most. Mr. Nian of the Four Seasons Tower. Chapter 451. Yun Yang hid under the snow, suppressing his emotions again and again, reminding himself over and over again. Mr. Nian. The person outside is indeed Mr. Nian. The person outside is the biggest enemy of my life. No matter what, I have to get through this. I have to survive this battle. I have to hold on until the moment I kill him. Otherwise, I won't be able to rest in peace. Not only will I not be able to rest in peace, but my brothers and my family will die with them as well. If I'm finished and give up, how can this boundless debt of blood and hatred be resolved? No matter how much he angers me, no matter how he provokes me, I have to get through this. I have to get through this. I can't die. I can't die. Yun Yang told himself over and over again. Slowly, his emotions calmed down again. Mr. Nian, who was outside, did not know that the psychological attack that he thought would work had instead become the source of Yun Yang's composure. This was the so-called self-destruction of one's own actions. The wisdom of a wise man might not always be what he thought. Sometimes it would produce the opposite effect. Therefore, the application of wisdom was extremely subtle indeed. It depended on one's heart, and did not allow for other thoughts. His elegant voice continued to ring, the content of his words growing more vicious as he spoke. It was no longer a part of his so-called elegance. That day, during the battle at Tianxian Cliff, the 9 Supremes whose names shook the nations of Tianxian had all come. But they had all lost the powers that made them famous. The scene of corpses flying everywhere was still fresh in my mind. Until now, I still remember that Supreme Earth, the leader of the 9 Supremes, had disintegrated instantly under a single palm strike. Even his head seemed to have been split into 7 or 8 pieces. Supreme Earth is worthy of being Supreme Earth, turning his life into soil in the end. I wonder if he can still live. Even if he dies, it's a worthy death. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Of course, Supreme Earth wants to perish in the earth. Yun Yang felt his heart wrenching violently, the pain indescribable. It was a suffocating pain, an extreme agony that could not be described with words. Yet he had to endure it. He had to endure it with all his might. No matter how painful it was, No matter how unbearable it was, he had to persevere. I can't be angry. I cannot be impulsive. He's forcing me to go out by saying that. He's so concerned about my life and death. It must be because the 9 Supremes have the power to shake him. I must not be impulsive. I must wait for the future. But I really want to rush out now and fight to the death. No one knew, and no one could understand, how painful and unbearable this kind of endurance was. It was as if his body, soul, and mind were being cut into pieces over and over again. But he still had to maintain his ice-cold composure. The voice from outside was still like a demonic voice that penetrated his brain. The voice laughed weirdly. Does it hurt? Do you feel so much pain that you want to die? Do you feel like you're about to collapse? He really wanted to fight with his life on the line. Wouldn't it be 10,000 times better than this? That's the happiest, the proudest work of my life. When the other 9 Supremes saw that Supreme Earth was dead, he actually went berserk. He charged forward without any form of defense. Of course, he was beaten into minced meat on the spot, dying even more thoroughly than Supreme Earth. Also, that Supreme Gold or whatever he was actually provoked him in front of so many experts, saying that he wanted to fight one-on-one. Now that I think about it, the impulse back then was probably to cover for your preparation, wasn't it? The dusty memories of the past surged once more. Yin Yang's body, soul, and mind were heavily pressured, and he was on the verge of collapsing. He had been controlling himself not to recall or think about the bloody past. Now, however, it was being dug up again by the mastermind of the incident. Yin Yang felt that his memories were still fresh in the depths of his heart, without a single detail left out. Today's situation is destined to end in death. However, we brothers can't all die here. It was the eldest Supreme Earth who was speaking. His voice was heavy and stern. Among us brothers, we can only strike once with our remaining abilities. There can't be any mishaps. Right now, the best outcome is only enough for one person to survive. I hope that this person is OL 9th. Supreme Earth's voice was urgent. His eyes scanned his brothers again and again, as if trying to remember them, so that they could reunite when they reached the underworld of the underworld. OL 9th is the youngest among us, but he's the smartest among the 9 of us. He acts only after planning, anticipates the enemy's moves, and is farsighted. At the same time, only if he's alive can he open the residence of 9 Supremes immediately and obtain OL 8th's legacy, and even our cultivation methods. He can cultivate all of the 9 Supremes' arcane skills alone, gathering the might of the 9 Supremes in one body. As for the others, they can only open it from the middle. They can only get a part of it, not all of it. Therefore we can die, but OL 9th has to live on. Give him this glimmer of hope. Pin the last glimmer of hope on him. As long as Supreme Cloud isn't dead, the legend of the 9 Supremes won't die. In the future, he will be the new 9 Supremes. The other brothers did not speak, listening to Supreme Earth's arrangement seriously. Their eyes were filled with agreement. None of them had any hesitation or doubt. The only voice of disapproval came from, I don't agree. Yin Yang seemed to hear his own voice. If we live together. If we die together. What's the point of giving me that glimmer of hope? I don't want it. Don't look down on me. What's there to be afraid of? What he had said then was like a child who was trying to be brave. There was no hint of a wise man's calmness in the face of danger. Knock him out. Take off his mask and find a brother to replace him. They can't cast their arcane skills anyway. It's the same for 800 people. Now whoever puts on the mask can be Supreme Cloud, one of the 9 Supremes. It was Supreme Earth's voice growling fiercely. It was also the last few words Yin Yang had heard. The last few words from his brothers. Scratch his face, make it look like he's heavily injured. OL youngest's good brother. Live on. You must live on. If you die, we brothers will really have no hope at all. Then he did not know anything, completely entering a state of suspended animation. At that time, he was drowned in the same excruciating agony. His head had also suffered a heavy blow, causing him to be completely muddled. The only thing he could feel was the vibrations of his brother's power. It was the activation of the remaining arcane skills. Then, there was no more then. When he woke up, He realized that he was like a tattered rag doll, buried in the ground with only one leg sticking out of the ground. No, it was broken outside, and had been chopped into several pieces. His head was like a rotten watermelon. There was a large hole in his chest where his heart was, a hole that could have been fatal. Obviously, although his brothers had disguised themselves, the enemy had not given up on any chance of survival. His head had still been smashed and a large hole had been punched through his heart. As for being buried in the ground, it must have been because someone had covered up all the corpses in the end. It was just that the combination of the 9 Supremes' remaining power had triggered the Cloud Manifestation's ability. Under the spiritual restraining formation, the Cloud Manifestation's ability had worked, allowing Yin Yang to survive the fatal injury, creating a miracle of life. There was also the Lotus Seed. That was why he was where he was now. My brother's hopes were all on me. I can't go out, I can't die. Outside, Mr. Nian's malicious voice could be heard. It's normal that you don't understand why we did it. On the other hand, I don't understand why you didn't die as well. There were 809 people in total, and we managed to gather 809 corpses. There's no mistake about this. In the end, everyone was dismembered, their hearts broken, their brains crippled. Supreme Cloud, why aren't you dead yet? Yin Yang's heart was bleeding. It doesn't matter that you're still resilient and unwilling to come out. I'll stay here with you until you can't take it anymore. Or until the moment you can't take it anymore and come out. The voice outside said faintly, Yutong's eastern defense is about to be breached anyway. The Empire of Yutong is about to become history. Whether you come out or not, you can't change this inevitable trend. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. This reputed one will be waiting here with you. A faint chuckle could be heard. Actually, this isn't too bad. At the very least, this reputed one knows that you're here. As long as you're not dead, this reputed one will sense it. I'll let you persevere like this, waiting for the Empire of Yutong, that you've protected with your life to perish. By the time you come out, everything will have vanished into thin air. That's a pretty good ending, isn't it? Yin Yang's heart sank. This was Yin Yang's other weakness right now, and it was indeed extremely difficult to deal with. If he were to be trapped here, no matter how valiant and fearless Fu Baoguo was on the Eastern Front, he would still be powerless against Han Sanhe's million-strong army and the power of an entire nation. He would never be a match for them. Once the Eastern Front was breached, they would march straight in. Yutong was defenseless. It would definitely be under Han Sanhe's steel cavalry. Chapter 452. Yun Yang was indeed anxious about the current situation, but there was nothing he could do. There was nothing he could do. Facing such a terrifying enemy, whether he could stay alive and ensure that he would not be found and killed, was already more difficult than ascending to heaven. There was no need to even think about escaping or winning the battle. Those were already far-fetched dreams. However, how should he deal with the current situation? Of course, we won't bear the great karma of a dynasty's rise and fall, but trapping you here is enough to seal this karma. It was still Mr. Nian's voice, but this time, he was guffawing into the sky, high-spirited as if everything was within his grasp. The truth was that everything was within his grasp. Yun Yang could only endure it without moving, endure it forever, until his energy was depleted, and he could no longer hold it in. There was no way to resolve the current situation. Despite his anxiety, Yun Yang's heart was about to explode, but there was nothing he could do. The eastern battlefield. The army that Han Sanhe had deployed stretched dozens of miles. Wherever it passed, it was like a black torrent that devoured everything. The Empire of Dongxuan's main force was moving at a slow pace. All the water sources along the way were under their control, without the slightest mistake. All the land near the battlefield had been plowed to ensure that all the trees and plants within sight had been cleared. Some of the steep peaks were even flattened by the ace cultivators Han Sanhe had sent. Dongxuan's military base was arranged into a huge fan shape. It was concave in the middle. Dongxuan's army maintained this formation and continued to advance. All the air vents along the way had been widened. Although the 4 empires had worked together to trap Supreme Cloud and Zio, Han Sanha would never let his guard down like De Yuan's marshal. The formation that he had set up now was a special formation that specifically targeted and guarded against the 9 supremes. Be it wind, cloud, thunder, lightning, water, or fire. You can forget about opening an opening here. If you're already trapped in Zio, that's great. However, if you're not, you won't have a place to strike even if you come to this battlefield. At the very least, if you want to directly cause great losses like before, it's absolutely impossible. On the main battlefield, there were only 200,000 men from Zhang Ge troop, who had arrived to fight Fu Baogua head-on. Both sides advanced and retreated. They had been in a stalemate for a long time. Fu Baogua's face remained calm and composed, calm and capable, unmoving like a mountain. Every day, he would find a certain time to gather his generals and joke around. He looked extremely relaxed and carefree, as if he did not care about his opponent or the battle at all. However, when he was alone, his face would immediately turn into a frown, and he would be deeply worried. The Dongxian Warsong army they were facing now was merely the vanguard. The real test was yet to come. However, the current situation was like a raging fire, abnormally intense. The military camp that Zhang Ge troop belonged to had never entered the main battlefield, only sending out a small force to harass the enemy each day. Every few days, they would send out a large army to attack, but they would retreat after a period of intense battle, never lingering to fight. Fu Baogua knew that Zhang Ge was only exhausting his combat power bit by bit, turning himself into an army that was weary from the prolonged battle to create favorable conditions for Han Sanha's army to arrive. However, it was one thing to understand, there was nothing he could do about it. He could only react passively and passively achieve the enemy's goal. Han Sanha had yet to arrive at the main battlefield. Along the way, he had used every method that he should and should not have used to defend against the 9 Supremes' ambush. As for Fu Baogua, he had also adopted the strategy of fortifying the walls and clearing the field. The mountains on the left and right of the Fortress of Resilience had been cleared by Fu Baogua. Even the rocks had been moved into the Fortress of Resilience to be used for war. The few mountains nearby had been destroyed as well. The trees in the forest further away had not been cleared, but Fu Baogua's army had turned them into sharp tree stumps that were half a man's height. Countless traps had been set up to cover the entire mountain range, ensuring that the mountains would not become Dongshuan's supporting force. Fu Baogua had set up no less than 100,000 traps within thousands of miles. Basically, the entire ground, including the forest, had turned into a beehive. Yutong's eastern front faced the Empire of Dongxian. The empire's national power was the greatest in the world, and they had the continent's top general, Han Sanha, as their marshal. Therefore, the Eastern Front had always been Yutong's most deployed military force. Currently, both sides of the battlefield were heavily guarded. Yutong's 350,000 men had been arranged into a swallow-wing defensive formation by Fu Baogua. From top to bottom, front to back, left to right, they were guarded like a steel bucket, impenetrable and unassailable. However, such a formation and arrangement could only be used under normal circumstances, or perhaps most circumstances. Once Han Sanha's main force arrived, they would only need to engage in battle to destroy most of their traps. Every day that Han Sanha's main force arrived at the main battlefield, there would be reinforcements from the Empire of Yutong. There were those sent by the Empire of Yutong, those who came on their own accord. Martial artists from the martial world came to help, and there were even groups of sects who came to help. All in all, there was an endless stream of reinforcements. Every day, the number of reinforcements would increase by tens of thousands. Even so, Fu Baogua had never felt truly relaxed. Martial artists who were skilled in martial arts had individual combat power that far surpassed ordinary soldiers, but once they entered the battlefield, their effectiveness might not be as great. The most important thing on the battlefield had always been discipline. It was cooperation. It was not individual heroism. It was one man's recklessness. These reinforcements had to go through a certain level of training before they could enter the battlefield. Otherwise, not only would their assistance be useless, it might even cause the opposite effect. Relatively speaking, it was the sex who could use them without worry. After all, there was discipline in the sex, there was teamwork and tacit understanding between them. In spite of this, they still could not blend into the military formation and be used as regular soldiers. Just a simple command and strict execution of orders was something that these reinforcements could never achieve. Looking afar from the fortress of resilience, dust billowed into the sky from the east, banners blotting out the sun. From Dongshuan's direction, another troop had arrived at the fortress of resilience. Fu Baoguo's frown deepened. With a glance, he could easily tell that the other party had sent another 200,000 soldiers. In spite of this, Han San's main force was still at the back, advancing slowly and unhurriedly. These few days, it was not only Yutong who had been sending in reinforcements, but Dongxian had also been sending in endless reinforcements. At this moment, from almost every direction within Dongxian Nation, there were troops coming to reinforce them. Zhangji's location was like an ocean where hundreds of rivers converged, attracting all the small lakes in the empire of Dongxian to gather and converge here. The troops would converge and attack in unison. If the enemy troops were to converge successfully, the enemy's morale would be boosted while their own troops would feel the pressure of a mountain pressing down on them. It would be detrimental to the military's morale. Wang Dinghua. Fu Baoguo was decisive as he hollered coldly. He summoned his best general. Yes, sir. I'll give you 30,000 steel cavalry. Charge forward. Yes. The enemy's reinforcements have just arrived, and their morale is at its peak. We must destroy this morale. Fu Baoguo's eyes were gleaming as his voice was chilling. I'll give you 30,000 steel cavalry for this battle to be a complete victory. But on top of that, I have a request. You have to bring back at least 25,000 men after the assault. This lowly general. As long as one person is missing, you'll be punished according to military law. Fu Baoguo snorted coldly. The current situation is disadvantageous to us. Only by breaking through the formation with minimal casualties and dampening the enemy's morale can we shock the enemy. If I let you and your 30,000 steel cavalry die in the enemy's formation, what's there to shock about? No matter how valiant your death is? The enemy can afford to die, but our army can't. This lowly general understands. I'll do my best until the day I die. The key to this battle is that the enemy has just arrived. Although their morale is high, it's inevitable that their men and horses will be exhausted. You can weave in between Zhang Ji's troops and the new troops, then kill your way back. As long as you're quick, it won't be difficult to achieve your goal. Fu Baoguo looked at the two troops that were rapidly approaching each other from afar and said coldly, they want to boost their morale and unite their armies. Even the cowards in the army would feel a sudden surge of bravery and confidence when it comes to something like this. As for me, I'll let you completely destroy this courage and confidence of theirs. Even if you can't destroy Dongshuan's morale, at least the morale of the two troops converging must not appear. Go! Wang Dinghua bellowed, taking the token arrow and turning to stride out, his face filled with determination. Fu Baoguo's expression was steely. He knew that the enemy's morale had been rising during this period of time. Right now was the best time to dampen their morale. When they had accumulated their morale to a certain level, he would annihilate them in one fell swoop. This would be the juncture where the enemy would feel defeated. As long as the plan was accomplished successfully, the army before them would not be much of a threat for a long period of time, at least until Han Sanha arrived, no matter how many troops there were. Now that the enemy's reinforcements had just arrived, Zhang Ge was welcoming them, while the shadow cavalry was still recuperating in the front line. If he took a detour and plunged right into the enemy's midst, the shadow cavalry would not be able to react in time. When the shadow cavalry moved again, the distance between them would be enough for Wang Dinghua to rush over with his men and rush back. He believed that when his steel cavalry charged back, the enemy's shadow cavalry would still be speeding up. They would not have the chance to meet each other after all. Whether we can fight for the time to recuperate before Han Sanha's main force arrives depends on this battle. Chapter 453. The 150,000 steel cavalry that Tai Zheng had left behind were Yutong's most elite troop, and also his trump card in this battle. Wang Dinghua was the best general under him. They should have more than a 90% chance of winning this battle. This timing was a God-given opportunity that would not come again if they missed it. Although there would be casualties when they charged into the formation, it would not be too much. In terms of the current war, this loss was extremely valuable. Mercy does not command soldiers. Love does not establish authority. Righteousness does not manage finances. Kindness does not serve as an official. Baogua, mercy does not command soldiers. This is the first. Why? Fu Baogua closed his eyes, the old Grand Commandant Fang Qingtian's earnest teachings flashing through his mind. Baogua, what is war? War, to both empires, is a battle of manpower, military force, material resources, financial resources, and perseverance. Whoever can last until the end will be the overlord, the winner. However, to the martial, war is a battle of casualties, exhaustion, and lives. It's a battle of who can last the longest. Whoever survives in the end will be the winner. You must remember that there is only victory and defeat on the battlefield. There is no mercy, no life. Fu Baogua heaved a long sigh towards the sky. Teacher. Listening to the uniform galloping of horses and Wang Dinghua's loud roar, followed by the thunderous sounds of attacks, he opened his eyes and looked at the determined and courageous warriors. No one was confident that they could come back alive after charging out this time. There would definitely be casualties. He just didn't know which familiar faces would be missing from this square formation. Teacher, what you said makes sense, but these are my comrades, my brothers. Wang Dinghua galloped forward on his horse. The cold wind that was mixed with the smell of blood on the battlefield blew on his face, but he didn't feel a trace of coldness or sternness, because the only feeling he had right now was that the blood in his entire body was burning. He felt like he was about to explode. It was at this moment, right now. In front of him was the enemy, beside him were his comrades, beneath him was a warhorse, and in his hands was a sharp blade. Beneath his feet was the battlefield. His eyes suddenly turned red, as if they had been dyed with blood. The 30,000 steel cavalry that Fu Baogua had given them followed behind him, galloping silently as well. Everyone knew that even though they had anticipated the enemy's moves, casualties were inevitable, and they might not be able to survive. However, no one thought too much about not being able to return, because everyone could feel their blood boiling, just like Wang Dinghua. The fighting spirit in Wang Dinghua's heart seemed to have infected every single one of the 30,000 cavalry behind him. Every pair of eyes was filled with burning morale. Only a fierce battle could truly let this fire be completely released. Although no one spoke, they couldn't help but urge their horses to move faster and faster. 30,000 men from the steel cavalry took a detour and charged out of Yutong's camp from the other side like a raging dragon. Then, they turned into a sharp arrow on the icy field, charging towards the east without turning back. Wang Dinghua was at the forefront, like the sharpest arrowhead, whistling in the air as he tore through the wind and obstructions. His entire body was on the horse's back, his upper body hanging in the air. His entire body was leaning forward, his hips dangling on the horse's back. His center of gravity was placed in front as well. Anyone who had ridden a horse before would know that doing so could save a lot of horsepower. And at the same time, it could create an inertia for the warhorse to charge forward. It was not only Wang Dinghua himself who was doing so. The 30,000 men behind him were doing the same. They were all moving forward, their hands not even holding the reins, only pressing their left hands lightly on the horses' heads, while their right hands gripped their weapons tightly, allowing them to stick close to the horses as if they were one. Their eyes were glowing with sparks, their blood boiling. They were all waiting quietly, waiting for the moment they would truly come into contact with the enemy. Once they did, the most brilliant blood in the world would erupt. The man on the horse seemed to have sensed the desire for battle in his companion's heart. It was as if the horse beneath him had also sensed the desire for battle and slaughter in his companion's heart. For a moment, it also bent over with all its might. Originally, it was able to cover a distance of 3 zhang in a single step. But now, with all its might, the horse's hooves soared into the air as it madly sprinted forward. It had already covered a distance of 4 to 5 zhang. The blood of the men was burning. The blood of the warhorses seemed to be burning at the same time, unstoppable. Just as Fu Baogua had expected, the enemy did not even manage to react to the sudden appearance of the ambush. After all, Fu Baogua had been like a cowardly tortoise in his shell these past few days. He did not step out, and did not engage in battle, creating a subtle feeling of defending until the very end. No one had expected him to choose to launch an attack when the enemy's two armies had converged and were at their peak. The 30,000 men from the Steel Cavalry had already galloped more than half the distance to their target before the enemy's scouts in the camp blared their horns to warn them. Ha ha ha, Wang Dinggua howled into the sky. At this moment, the biting cold wind was still howling, sweeping past his body at high speed. His battle robe made a violent crackling sound as it was blown by the wind. Wang Dinggua's voice seemed to suddenly appear in the middle of winter, like a thunderclap in the clear sky, abruptly resounding in the air. Brothers! Wang Dinggua's voice was hoarse and high-pitched, like a thunderclap. The 30,000 men from the Steel Cavalry hollered in unison, "Here! We are Yutong's Steel Cavalry!" Wang Dinggua roared. "Unrivaled!" The 30,000 men from the Steel Cavalry replied in unison. "We were born here. Born here. We grew up here. We grew up here. This is our land. Our land. This is the land we swore to defend with our lives. The land we swore to defend with our lives. Defend with our lives. Defend with our lives." Wave after wave of voices rose higher and higher, becoming louder and louder. The morale of the 30,000 men from the Steel Cavalry had already reached its peak. Now, with Wang Dinggua's thunderous roar, they felt like they had broken through their limits again. They were so excited that they were about to explode. "The enemy is in front of us." Wang Dinggua's pupils seemed to be dilating. His blood was coursing through his veins. "Enemy!" The 30,000 men roared in unison. "Comrades are beside us. Comrades! Home is behind us. Home!" The sound waves in the surroundings became louder and louder. The momentum was unstoppable, and it surged powerfully in the sky above the icy battlefield. It was like thunder exploding in the sky over and over again. It was deafening and soul-stirring. For our parents. In Wang Dinggua's eyes, he could already see the two armies that were converging. They had split up their men, and were mobilizing urgently to face him, intending to stop his charge. He raised his hand slowly, the 17-foot-long steel blade in his hand glowing brightly. "Parents!" The 30,000 men from the Steel Cavalry raised their weapons at the same time, pointing their blades forward. "For our children! Children! For our women! Women!" Their voices grew louder and louder, until they turned into thunder that shook one to the core. Yutong's Steel Cavalry could no longer hold back the blood that was gushing out of their hearts. They howled into the sky, their auras like raging lions as they charged down the mountain. The arrows in front of them rained down like a storm, raining down on their heads. "Kill!" Wang Dinggua swung his saber and leaped with his steed, charging into the rain of arrows like a black comet and into the enemy's formation. Almost at the same time, a rain of blood sprayed into the air. This battle was destined to be a legendary epic forged by steel and blood. Wang Dinggua, who was at the forefront, was like a red-hot blade that was plunged into the icy-cold cream on the other side. "Kill!" Behind him, the 30,000 men from the Steel Cavalry roared in unison, as if they were about to bellow the blood that was coursing through their hearts. Each of them felt as if every strand of their hair was standing on end. The 30,000 men from the Steel Cavalry were like an unstoppable black flood, roaring as they charged into the enemy's formation at the fastest speed possible. They were unstoppable, and there was no turning back. It was as if a miracle had happened. The long-distance assault had continued until now, but the giant triangular arrow formed by the 30,000 men from the Steel Cavalry did not show any signs of disorder. Not a single person was left behind. Each of the Steel Cavalry was guarding their respective positions strictly. In the formation, the 30,000 men seemed to have formed a single entity as they charged into the point where the enemy's hundreds of thousands of troops were gathered. Far away, Zhang Ge, who had been waiting to meet up with his comrades, but had been forced to stand on a higher spot, due to the sudden incident, suddenly shuddered subconsciously when he saw the scene. This was because, the instant the 30,000 steel cavalry crashed into their camp in an unstoppable manner, Zhang Ge clearly saw a neat wave of blood suddenly soar into the sky. His entire field of vision turned crimson at that very moment. The battlefield seemed to have frozen at that very moment. All of his movements seemed to have turned into slow motion. The wave of blood rose into the air and lingered in the air. By the time the rain of blood fell, the 30,000 men from the steel cavalry had charged through like a sharp arrow. This kind of speed was simply unheard of. But at that moment, Wang Dinggue and his men from the steel cavalry did not notice that their speed had already created history in cavalry. They only roared crazily and pressed forward. Charge! Charge! Chapter 454. Blood rained down on the ground, dyeing the ground crimson, but not a single drop landed on the 30,000 men of the steel cavalry. How fast, how efficient, how sensational and how unbelievable was this? Wang Dinggue was still leading the charge. His mind was blank. He could not think of anything else. There was only the enemy in his eyes. There was only the front. That was a true sense of not turning back, moving forward courageously. Yutong's steel cavalry. Wang Dinggue roared. He was still leaning forward to conserve his horse's energy, but the saber in his hand had already turned into a ray of light. Pu. 40 to 50 heads flew into the sky in succession. There were also more than 10 severed upper bodies that fell in all directions. Perfectly round pillars of blood shot up into the sky. By the time the corpses fell to the ground, Wang Dinggue and his steed had already charged at least 1,000 feet ahead of them. He was so fast, so unstoppable, unrivaled in the world. The 30,000 men behind him roared along with Wang Dinggue's roar. 30,000 men of the steel cavalry followed Wang Dinggue like a torrential flood, charging forward without any interruption. 30,000 men were like one man. This was definitely a highlight in the history of cavalry warfare. Kill! Wang Dinggue's voice was gradually turning hoarse. He had obviously shouted too much, but his aura did not diminish. Instead it increased. Kill! 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 The steel cavalry roared. 10,000 men pointed forward, another 10,000 to the left, and another 10,000 to the right. They continued to charge forward without a hint of panic. With a loud clang, an enemy general in front of Wang Dinggue was knocked back 30 feet along with his horse. Both man and horse bled from their orifices as they looked at Wang Dinggue in despair. However, Wang Dinggue did not even spare them a glance as he galloped away in a cloud of dust. He had risked his life to intercept them, but they didn't even have the qualifications to look at him. The enemy general was dead. Even as he breathed his last, he died with a grievance. Woo woo! The sound of a special horn could be heard. Wang Dinggue knew in his heart that the enemy was mobilizing their archers, gathering a large number of archers to focus on sniping and killing. However, Wang Dinggue really didn't care about anything. There was only one belief in his heart. Pierce! Wang Dinggue once again roared to the sky, leading the 30,000 cavalrymen. He charged forward in a straight line amidst the converging army of the enemy. Wherever he passed, men and horses were thrown off their feet. Heads rolled, limbs flew, and blood flowed like a stream. The aura sent chills down the spines of all the Dongxian soldiers, who were fighting Yutong's steel cavalry. His heart was filled with a chill that was much worse than the midwinter snow that his body had to endure. Was he still human? With another loud clang, Wang Dinggue split the 3 Dongxian soldiers in front of him into 6 pieces. Suddenly, he felt an inexplicable sense of relief as his vision cleared up. He had already broken through the enemy's rear formation. The first half of the chisel tactic was completed. Success! Wang Dinggue did not turn back with his horse. Instead, he maintained his forward speed and galloped for about 20,000 feet before he turned his horse around and made a half circle. In front of his saber was still Dongxuan's formation. The galloping was still thunderous. The entire troop was still orderly. The 30,000 steel cavalry followed Wang Dinggue in a half circle, almost unscathed, facing Dongxuan's troop head-on, drenched in blood. Every single one of them had blood dripping down from their bodies, armor, and heads. Each of them was dyed red, blood red. It was as if tens of thousands of death gods had suddenly descended to the mortal world. The fiendish aura that was condensed by this team of assassins was not only daunting, it was simply terrifying to the point that one's heart and soul would scatter with just a glance. Wang Dingwa did not stop. With a loud roar, he launched the second wave of chisel tactic. Yutong's steel cavalry. Charge back with me. Charge back. Behind him, all the steel cavalry bellowed in unison as before. Their legs clamped on their horses' abdomens, and their bodies left the saddle, stretching forward to their limits. Each of them howled like they were possessed by demons as they raised their weapons and followed behind Wang Dingwa. After charging for 2 breaths, the neat formation turned into a black whirlwind and a black arrow once more. It was still unstoppable and unstoppable. Dongxian brat, who dares fight your father? Wang Dingwa felt his blood burning to its limit, his blood vessels expanding like never before as he roared into the sky. Together with his horse, he charged into Dongxuan's formation once more. At this moment, even if all the pinnacle experts in the world were to intercept him, Wang Dingwa would still dare to fight without hesitation. The accumulation of his aura at this moment had truly risen to a level of invincibility. At the very least, his aura was unquestionable and impeccable. Fight! 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 The tens of thousands of steel cavalry behind Wang Dingwa roared similarly, their blood vessels expanding as they charged into the enemy's formation. They charged forward like a hot knife through butter, advancing as if there was no one there. This time, there were countless arrows soaring into the sky from both sides of the steel cavalry, raining down like a dark storm. Dongxian was obviously not prepared for the steel cavalry's charge, but they were already prepared to counter it. The dense rain of arrows from both sides was the best counterattack they could come up with at the moment. However, the current best and most targeted counterattack strategy might not be able to produce immediate results and be effective. The steel cavalry was fully armored. As long as they were not unlucky enough to be shot in the face, they would be fine. Even against the rain of arrows, the tens of thousands of steel cavalry continued to press forward. Wherever they passed, it was still the same as before. Men and horses were thrown off their feet. Many of the Dongxian soldiers felt their guts shattering when they saw them charging over. They instinctively wanted to dodge, no longer having the thought of fighting or intercepting them. The ground in the distance shook. That was Dongxuan's elite troop, the shadow cavalry that could rival the steel cavalry, moving in full force, waiting to strike. Wang Dingwa's roar was like thunder. Standing at the forefront, he was practically shaking the enemy's formation single-handedly, but no one could stop him. Not even for a second, a snap of a finger, a split second. Wherever he passed, he only needed to swing his saber, and he would be unimpeded. The horn sounded tragically in the enemy's formation. It was the order to fight to the death, the activation of the battle strategy. It was obvious that Dongxuan's main general had the intention to kill the 30,000 steel cavalry. He wanted to bury all 30,000 of them here. When such a military order was given, every soldier in Dongxuan's army would turn into a sacrificial warrior at once. Those who did not charge forward would be punished by military law, beheading on the spot. The battle grew more intense because of that. The steel cavalry continued to charge forward in a frenzy like a thunderstorm, but the enemy's counterattack suddenly became unusually fierce as well. Extreme against extreme. The consequences were extremely devastating. Many of the steel cavalry were pushed off their steeds by Dongxuan's warriors, who suddenly pounced on them. Falling off their steeds abruptly, both of them were trampled into meat paste by the people around them. But their steeds continued to follow the formation, charging forward with their original momentum. Yutong's steel cavalry was unmoved by the sacrifice of their comrades and the fall of their steeds. Their eyes were only focused forward. Charge. Kill. In such a battle atmosphere, falling off one's steed was equivalent to being consigned to eternal damnation. No expert, no master could save the fallen from their steeds from such a battle. Kill. Kill. Wang Dingwa led the charge, guffawing like thunder. His saber light was like lightning, He was like a god of war that knew no fatigue. Heads were rolling in front of him, and fresh blood was flowing like a waterfall. Behind him, his comrades were constantly falling off their horses. Just as the battle was gradually reaching its climax, Wang Dinggua let out another wild roar. His front suddenly felt relaxed, and he once again rushed out of the enemy's formation. Behind him, a black torrent surged forward without stopping. The piercing tactic was a success once again. Now the established strategy was completed. Wang Dingchao was still galloping madly on his horse. His tall and sturdy body suddenly stood upright on the horse's back. He pointed his blood-dripping long saber towards the sky and shouted loudly, "Brothers, we have won this battle. Follow me home." This was not an order to the troops behind him, but a ritual to summon the souls of their fallen brothers from Yutong's steel cavalry after each battle. Behind him, all the Yutong steel cavalry who had charged out of the enemy's formation stood up on their steeds at the same time, their weapons pointed at the sky. "Brothers, come home with us." "Roar!" Wang Dinggua hollered. All the steel cavalry behind him roared in unison. "Don't worry, brothers, I'm still here. The family's matters shall be shouldered by me. You have meritorious military service, I have my life. Father and children shall not worry for the rest of their lives." This was the practice of Yutong's steel cavalry. The first thing the survivors did after every battle was to look for their comrades' family and take good care of them. It was also the last consolation to the loyal souls. A steel torrent charged out of the enemy's formation, still a sharp triangular arrowhead, charging forward with an indomitable will. When we fight, we press forward. Those who stand in our way are invincible. When we charge out, when we return with the souls of our brothers, we still press forward with an indomitable will. Yutong's steel cavalry will always be Yutong's steel cavalry. Life and death are the same. Fourth chapter, Seeking Monthly Votes. These few chapters have made my blood boil. Chapter 455. Yutong's steel cavalry roared as they galloped away, returning victorious. It was a pity that it was not a complete victory. It would only be a complete victory if none of the 30,000 men from the steel cavalry were killed. However, that was only a fantasy in novels. In a real battle, how could none of them be killed when 30,000 men charged? Behind the 30,000 steel cavalry galloped away was the messy Dongxian military camp. The trail of blood was still open, a ghastly sight to behold. It was at this moment that a cavalry from the left charged over like a raging dragon. The leader hollered furiously from afar, "Wang Dinggua, stay and fight me if you have the guts." Wang Dinggua could not help guffawing when he heard the challenge. Suddenly he roared into the sky, "Yutong's steel cavalry." Behind him, all his comrades guffawed at the same time. Unrivaled in the world, Wang Dinggua did not slow down at all as he led the charge towards his own military camp, roaring, "Dongshuan's shadow cavalry. Just bullsh asterisk T. Dongshuan's shadow cavalry is just bullsh asterisk T." The steel cavalry behind him galloped away guffawing. "The next time we meet, I'll take your head." Wang Dinggua guffawed. "Grandpa is tired today. I won't keep you company. Ha ha ha." Amidst the maniacal laughter, Yutong's steel cavalry charged back like a torrent. The Dongxian shadow cavalry, who had rushed over, almost spat blood when they heard the string of words. They were only 10 breaths away from stopping the enemy. Each of the shadow cavalry's warhorses had almost broken their legs from running to catch up to Yutong's steel cavalry. But they were still a short distance away, unable to stop the enemy. In the end, they could only watch the enemy gallop away like an arrow released from a bow. They had even brushed past each other. They were fuming with rage, but there was no place for them to vent it. Poof! The leader of Dongshuan's shadow cavalry slammed the spear in his hand onto the ground in front of him, causing a large piece of ground to fly up as he cursed, "Wang Dinggua, I must kill you." With a wave of his hand he ordered, "Go back." Witnessing the steel cavalry's charge like a gust of wind and retreat like a torrent, his gaze was filled with awe. The valiance of the steel cavalry was so uniform that it had reached a horrifying level. How could such a strong army be destroyed? Fu Baogua, as expected of a famous marshal of a generation, Attacking at this time was obvious. However, he had done it. Zhang Ge looked at the generals and Dongxian soldiers around him. Everyone's faces were filled with rage and humiliation. But it was undeniable that there was still a faint trace of fear on everyone's faces. There was a deep sense of shock at the bottom of everyone's eyes. The high morale and confidence of victory that had been built up because of Fu Baoguo's cowardice and passive defense, as well as the jubilation from the reunion of the two armies, had vanished without a trace. The biggest loss of this battle was that their high morale had been ruthlessly smashed back into the dust by the enemy. Zhang Ge understood that it would be difficult to raise their morale within a short period of time. In other words, before Marshal Han Sanhe's main force arrived, Dongxuan's army would be exhausted. It was not that they were powerless to fight, but they had lost the drive that they should have. The enemy's 30,000 cavalrymen charged through the formation and broke through the confluence of 300,000 soldiers twice. After killing them, they swaggered away. The enemy's morale was so high because of this that it could be ignited. If he were to attack now, there was a high chance that Fu Baoguo would deploy all his troops to fight him. However, one side's morale was low, while the other side's fighting spirit was high. Under such a contrast of morale, he had no hope of victory. He could only suffer a crushing defeat, or even collapse at the slightest touch. His army would collapse like a landslide, and he would suffer a crushing defeat. Zhang Ge could not afford such a result. All troops fall back and reorganize. Shadow cavalry, point forward to prevent the enemy from attacking again. Zhang Ge could only give the order after a long moment of thought. He sighed inwardly. He had thought that he was not inferior to the world's famous generals, at least not too far away. He had even belittled Fu Baoguo's defense earlier, thinking that the other was merely SOSO, and that he was undeserving of being called the top of Yutong's younger generation. Today, however, he had been taught a bloody lesson by Fu Baoguo, whom he had looked down on. Indeed, those who could rank at the top of the ranking of famous generals were not to be trifled with. The top of Yutong's younger generation, one of Yutong's 3 military bosses, Fang Qingtian's appointed successor, lived up to his reputation. Such a grasp of the battle opportunity, such a swift and decisive method, such an unexpected tactic. It's indeed sharp and impressive. Zhang Ji's eyes glowed with fighting spirit as he murmured. But no matter how good you Fu Baoguo are, you're definitely not teacher's opponent. His teacher, Han Sanhe, was the continent's top general. However, Zhang Ge did not realize that he had forever lost the right to compete with Fu Baoguo on the battlefield when he thought so. Wang Dinggui spurred his horse forward like a sharp arrow, charging to the front of Yutong's army. Fu Baoguo was already standing at the door. His arms were behind his back, his expression calm. Looking at his expression, it was as if Wang Dinggui had only contributed a little in this battle, and was not worthy of praise at all. It was nothing like the meritorious deed he had mentioned earlier. In spite of this, the slight trembling of his hands behind his back had long betrayed him, expressing his true feelings at the moment. Fu Baoguo was also sweating profusely about this battle. Even if the success rate of this battle was already 90%, and his previous actions had confused the enemy's general, causing them to underestimate him, indirectly contributing to the success of this battle, there was still a great risk involved. What if the enemy's general did not fall for it? What if he thought deeper? What if he saw through his plan? The marshal of the enemy, Zhang Ge, was also a famous general of Dongxian. He was almost the top person in Dongxuan's military after Han Sanhe. His reputation was well known as well. If Zhang Ge had seen through Yun Yang's intentions, he only needed to conceal the Dongxian shadow cavalry behind where the two armies converged and wait for the steel cavalry to attack, intercepting them head-on. Then, all 30,000 steel cavalry would be annihilated without a doubt. Fortunately, they had finally won this battle. Their mission was a success. The steel cavalry came like a gust of wind, stopping neatly in front of the army with a long horn. Wang Baoguo turned his horse around and hollered sternly, "Steel cavalry, count the men." He leaned forward slightly. The casualties of the 30,000 steel cavalry had been counted. Wang Baoguo turned to face Fu Baoguo. "Marshal, This general has given the order. We've pierced through the enemy twice in this battle. 30,000 steel cavalry. But there are still 27,352 men left. Although his voice was heroic, there was an indescribable hoarseness in it. It was only now that the sorrow surged up like a tidal wave. The 27,352 men behind him sat unmoving on their horses like javelins, but their eyes were glistening with tears. 30,000 men had attacked the enemy's 2 armies, a total of 300,000 men, but they had only lost 2,648 men. It was less than 11%. It was a glorious victory. However, the Steel Cavalry brothers' hearts were heavy at this moment. More than 2,000 brothers who had been with them day and night, who had been so close to them, had been buried in the battlefield. Not even their bones were left. Opposite them, Fu Baoguo's expression was solemn as he raised his hand to salute, and said in a low voice, "All troops, listen up. All of you salute our 2,648 brothers. Send them off. I wish all of you a safe journey." The thumping of the war drums reverberated in a soul-stirring manner. The loyal souls shall not perish, they shall live with the nation. When Yutong's warriors died in battle, they would send them off with the beating of the war drums whenever they had time to spare. Perhaps other generals would pay homage after the war ended, to pay tribute to the loyal souls. However, Fu Baoguo would not do so. The first thing he did after each battle was to send off the warriors who had died in battle. He wished that their souls would not be far away, and that they could still hear the farewells of their comrades from their homeland. Well done. Really well done. Fu Baoguo's Adam's apple bobbed twice, his voice dry. He blinked his eyes hard, trying to control his sorrowful emotions as he called out hoarsely, "Wang Dinghua. Here. Later. I want you to find out the names, achievements, life experiences, birthplaces of our fallen brothers. Make a list of all of them, and record them in the file. Seal up their wills and belongings. After the war, report to His Majesty and ask for more compensation. Let the brothers rest in peace, and rest in the afterlife with a smile." Yes, the Steel Cavalry has contributed greatly in this war. Tally up the achievements and report them to me as well. Yes, return to the troops, Fu Baoguo commanded. 27,000 men of the Steel Cavalry moved at the same time. However, at the next moment, everyone froze with an unusually complicated expression. They froze. They had not noticed it just now. But it was only now that they realized that more than 27,000 men from the Steel Cavalry had returned from the war. This was not wrong. In spite of this, there were more than 29,000 war horses that had returned. In other words, there were still about 2,000 ownerless war horses in the formation. Each of them stood where they were, bewildered and helpless. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.